The last frame. The Arctic wind howled across the frozen tundra of Svalbard as wildlife photographer Paul Harrison adjusted his telephoto lens for what he believed would be the shot of a lifetime. The September morning carried with it the crisp bite of approaching winter, and the landscape stretched endlessly before him in shades of white and steel grey. Paul had no way of knowing that in less than 12 hours his name would be broadcast across international news networks, forever linked to one of the most documented polar bear attacks in recent history. Paul Harrison, 34 years old, had built his reputation over the past decade, capturing the raw beauty and danger of Arctic wildlife. His photographs had graced the covers of National Geographic, Wildlife Photography magazine, and countless nature documentaries. Born in Anchorage, Alaska, to a family of outdoor enthusiasts, Paul had grown up understanding the delicate balance between human ambition and nature's untamed power. His father, Robert Harrison, had been a bush pilot who ferried researchers and adventurers across Alaska's most remote regions. His mother, Elena, was a marine biologist who had spent years studying the effects of climate change on Arctic ecosystems. It was from them that Paul inherited both his fearless approach to dangerous environments and his deep respect for the creatures he photographed. Standing at 6 feet 2 inches with weathered hands and keen green eyes that seemed to anticipate every movement in the wilderness, Paul carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced down grizzlies in Katmai, tracked wolves through Yellowstone's backcountry, and spent countless nights alone in some of the world's most unforgiving environments. His equipment, worth over $40,000, represented the culmination of years of careful investment and technological advancement. The Canon EOS R5 body, with its 45-megapixel sensor, paired with a 600mm f4 telephoto lens, could capture details invisible to the naked eye from distances that kept him safely removed from his subjects. Or so he had always believed. The expedition had been organized by Arctic Adventures Unlimited, a premium wildlife tour company based in Longyearbyen, Svalbard's administrative center. The company, founded 12 years earlier by former Arctic guide Magnus Eriksson, specialized in small group expeditions that promised intimate encounters with polar wildlife while maintaining strict safety protocols. Magnus, a broad-shouldered Norwegian in his early 50s, with ice-blue eyes and a graying beard, had spent more than 2 decades guiding visitors through the Arctic. His reputation for safety was impeccable. In 12 years of operation, no client had ever suffered more than minor injuries from cold exposure or falls on icy terrain. Magnus stood now at the edge of their base camp, established on a flat expanse of permafrost approximately 15 kilometers northeast of Ny-Ålesund, scanning the horizon through binoculars. The camp consisted of 8 heavy-duty Arctic tents arranged in a rough circle, with a central area containing cooking equipment, communication gear, and emergency supplies. A bright orange emergency shelter stood slightly apart from the main camp, stocked with additional food, medical supplies, and a backup satellite phone. Every precaution had been taken, every protocol followed to the letter. The 27 tourists who had paid premium prices for this 8-day expedition represented a diverse cross-section of wildlife enthusiasts, photographers, and adventure seekers. Among them were Dr. Sarah Chen, a veterinarian from Vancouver who specialized in Arctic animal physiology, Michael and Janet Rodriguez, a retired couple from Phoenix celebrating their 30th wedding anniversary, Klaus Weber, a German engineer and amateur photographer seeking to expand his portfolio, and Rebecca Thompson, a freelance journalist from London documenting the impact of climate change on polar bear populations. Dr. Chen, 42 years old with sharp features and prematurely grey hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, had joined the expedition both for personal enjoyment and professional development. Her veterinary practice in Vancouver frequently treated animals suffering from the effects of environmental changes, and she hoped to better understand the challenges facing Arctic species in their natural habitat. She had packed specialized equipment for taking non-invasive biological samples, hoping to contribute data to ongoing research projects studying polar bear health and population dynamics. Michael Rodriguez, 68, had dreamed of seeing polar bears in the wild since childhood. A former mechanical engineer with Caterpillar Incorporated, he had spent his career designing heavy machinery but harbored a lifelong passion for wildlife photography. His wife, Janet, 65, had initially been reluctant to undertake such a challenging journey, but had been won over by Michael's enthusiasm and the promise of an adventure to celebrate their milestone anniversary. They had spent months preparing physically and mentally for the expedition, taking Arctic survival courses and investing in high-quality cold weather gear. Klaus Weber, 51, represented the technical end of the photography spectrum. A precision engineer from Munich who had transitioned into wildlife photography as a serious hobby, Klaus approached every shoot with Germanic efficiency and attention to detail. His equipment rivaled Paul's in sophistication, though he lacked the professional's intuitive understanding of animal behavior. Klaus had participated in expeditions to photograph penguins in Antarctica, snow leopards in the Himalayas, and tigers in India, but the Arctic represented his most challenging environment yet. Rebecca Thompson, 38, carried herself with the restless energy of someone constantly seeking the next story. A former war correspondent who had covered conflicts in Syria and Afghanistan, she had pivoted to environmental journalism after experiencing burnout from years of documenting human suffering. The polar bear expedition represented both a professional opportunity and personal healing journey. Her articles for The Guardian and The Independent had garnered international attention for their unflinching examination of climate change impacts on vulnerable ecosystems. The supporting team included Dr. James Mitchell, the expedition's wildlife biologist and safety officer, Eric Johansson, Magnus's second-in-command and an expert tracker, and Lisa Kowalski, the team's medic and communications specialist. Dr. Mitchell, 47, had spent the past 15 years studying polar bear behavior and population dynamics across the Arctic. His presence on the expedition served dual purposes, ensuring guest safety and collecting data for ongoing research projects funded by the Norwegian Polar Institute. Eric Johansson, 39, had grown up in northern Sweden before moving to Svalbard 8 years earlier. His ability to read weather patterns, track animals across seemingly barren terrain, and anticipate changes in ice conditions had made him invaluable to Magnus's operation. Eric possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense when wildlife was present long before it became visible, a skill that had prevented numerous, potentially dangerous encounters over the years. Lisa Kowalski, 34, was a former paramedic from Toronto who had relocated to Svalbard after falling in love with the Arctic during a research expedition 3 years earlier. Her medical training, combined with specialized knowledge of cold weather injuries and wildlife attacks, made her an essential team member. She carried comprehensive medical supplies capable of treating everything from hypothermia to traumatic injuries, though she hoped never to need the more severe intervention equipment. The expedition had begun 6 days earlier, with 2 days of preparation and briefing in Longyearbyen. Magnus had conducted extensive safety orientations, covering everything from proper cold weather clothing layering to emergency procedures in the event of wildlife encounters. Every participant had been required to demonstrate proficiency with bear spray and flare guns. They had practiced tent entry and exit procedures, learned to identify signs of polar bear presence, and participated in mock emergency evacuations. The group had traveled to their current location aboard the Arctic Explorer, a specially modified vessel designed for polar expeditions. The journey had taken them through the breathtaking landscape of the Kongsfjorden, past towering glaciers and dramatic ice formations. Marine wildlife sightings during the transit had included several species of seals, Arctic foxes, and distant polar bears hunting along ice edges. Upon establishing base camp, the first 4 days had proceeded according to plan. The group had observed and photographed polar bears from safe distances, documented Arctic fox behavior, and captured stunning images of the northern lights. Weather conditions had been favorable, with temperatures ranging from -15 to -8 degrees Celsius and moderate winds. Everyone had adapted well to the challenging conditions, and morale remained high. Paul had been particularly successful during these initial days, capturing several sequences of polar bear hunting behavior that he knew would be highly sought after by publishers and documentary producers. His telephoto lens had allowed him to maintain appropriate distances while still capturing intimate behavioral details. He had developed a particular interest in a large male polar bear that the team had designated as Bear Alpha, an impressive specimen estimated to weigh over 500 kilograms, with distinctive scarring around his left ear. Bear Alpha had been observed on 3 separate occasions over the past 4 days, always at distances exceeding the recommended 500 meters. Dr. Mitchell had noted the bear's behavior in his research logs, describing the animal as a mature male in prime condition, displaying typical solitary hunting patterns. The bear showed no particular interest in the human camp, focusing instead on hunting seals along nearby ice formations. On the morning of September 8th, Paul woke before dawn with unusual excitement. Weather conditions were forecast to be exceptional, with clear skies and minimal wind providing ideal photography conditions. The previous evening's wildlife observations had indicated increased polar bear activity in the area, likely related to seasonal hunting patterns as sea ice conditions changed with approaching winter. Paul's routine began at 0430 hours with a careful inspection of his equipment. Every lens was cleaned and calibrated, battery levels checked and backups prepared. He had charged all electronic devices using the camp's portable generator and reviewed his shot list for the day. His primary objective was to capture behavioral sequences showing polar bear interactions with changing ice conditions, images that would dramatically illustrate the environmental challenges facing Arctic wildlife. Magnus conducted the morning briefing at 0600 hours, reviewing weather forecasts, planned shooting locations, and safety protocols. Wind speeds were expected to remain below 15 kilometers per hour, with temperatures holding steady around -12 degrees Celsius. Visibility would be excellent, with sunrise occurring at 7:23 and sunset at 18:45, providing nearly 11 hours of photographic opportunities. The plan called for the group to establish 3 observation points at different locations around the camp, each positioned to take advantage of optimal lighting conditions and known wildlife corridors. Paul requested permission to work from the northernmost position, approximately 800 meters from base camp, where ice formations created natural blinds and provided excellent vantage points for photographing bears hunting along ice edges. Dr. Mitchell raised mild concerns about the distance from base camp, but agreed to Paul's request after confirming that Eric would maintain visual contact and that Paul would carry both primary and backup communication devices. Lisa double-checked Paul's emergency medical supplies and reviewed hand signal protocols for communicating across the extended distances. The group departed base camp at 7:45 hours, with Eric leading and Magnus bringing up the rear. They moved in single file across the frozen terrain, following established paths that avoided potentially unstable ice areas. The morning air was crystalline clear, with visibility extending to the horizon in all directions. Aurora Borealis remnants still danced faintly in the northern sky as dawn light began to illuminate the landscape. Paul reached his designated position at 8:30 hours and immediately began setting up his equipment. The location was ideal. A slight elevation provided commanding views across several square kilometers of typical polar bear habitat, while ice formations offered concealment from wildlife that might be sensitive to human presence. He established his primary shooting position behind a natural ice blind, with backup positions identified at intervals along the ridge. Through his telephoto lens, Paul began systematically scanning the terrain for signs of wildlife activity. His trained eye picked out details that others might miss: tracks in the snow, disturbed ice formations, and subtle changes in the behavior of Arctic birds that often indicated the presence of larger predators. The morning's first significant sighting occurred at 9:15 hours when Paul spotted 3 Arctic foxes moving purposefully across the landscape approximately 2 kilometers to the northeast. The foxes' behavior immediately caught Paul's attention. Rather than the typical hunting or exploratory movements he had observed over the previous days, these animals moved with obvious urgency, periodically stopping to look back over their shoulders. Paul had learned over years of wildlife photography that prey species often provided the earliest warnings of apex predator presence, and the fox's behavior strongly suggested that a polar bear might be in the vicinity. Paul immediately activated his communication device and reported the sighting to Magnus at the base coordination point. Magnus acknowledged and instructed all observation teams to increase vigilance while maintaining their positions. Dr. Mitchell noted the time and behavior in his research log, commenting that the fox's movements were consistent with displacement by a large predator. At 9:47 hours, Paul's patience and experience were rewarded when Bear Alpha emerged from behind an ice formation approximately 1,000 meters to the northeast. Even at that distance, Paul could identify the distinctive scarring that marked this particular animal. The bear moved with the confident, measured pace of a dominant predator, stopping periodically to test the air with his sensitive nose. Paul began photographing immediately, adjusting his camera settings to account for the bright morning light reflecting off the snow and ice. The conditions were perfect for capturing sharp images with excellent detail. Through his viewfinder, Paul watched Bear Alpha demonstrate classic polar bear hunting behavior, methodically checking ice edges and seal breathing holes. For the next 45 minutes, Paul documented Bear Alpha's activities while maintaining constant awareness of the bear's location and movement patterns. The animal showed no interest in the human presence, focusing entirely on hunting activities. Paul captured several sequences showing the bear's powerful swimming abilities as he moved between ice flows, his impressive size and strength evident even at considerable distance. At 10:32 hours, Bear Alpha disappeared behind a large ice formation, heading in a direction that would take him away from the human observation area. Paul continued monitoring through his telephoto lens, but saw no further sign of the bear. He reported the last known position to Magnus and received approval to continue shooting from his current position while remaining alert for the bear's possible return. The morning continued with excellent photography opportunities. Paul captured images of Arctic birds, documented the interplay of light and shadow across the ice formations, and took several landscape shots that showcased the raw beauty of the Svalbard environment. His equipment performed flawlessly, and he found himself accumulating what he knew would be some of his finest Arctic work. At 11:48 hours, Paul observed unusual behavior among a group of seals approximately 1,500 meters to the east. The animals, which had been resting peacefully on ice formations, suddenly became agitated and began moving toward the water with obvious urgency. Paul immediately began photographing the scene while scanning the area for what had disturbed the seals. Bear Alpha reappeared at 12:03 hours, approaching the seal colony from the north in a perfect demonstration of polar bear hunting strategy. Paul watched through his telephoto lens as the massive predator employed stealth and patience, using ice formations and wind direction to mask his approach. The bear's movements were fluid and purposeful, each step calculated to bring him closer to his prey without alerting them to his presence. Paul documented the entire hunting sequence, capturing images that illustrated the sophisticated predatory behavior of Arctic's apex predator. The photographs showed Bear Alpha's careful approach, his explosive burst of speed when striking distance was achieved, and the dramatic moment when he secured a seal kill. The sequence represented exactly the type of behavioral documentation that Paul's professional reputation was built upon. After successfully hunting, Bear Alpha remained at the kill site for approximately 30 minutes before moving away with his prey. Paul observed the bear travel in a generally westerly direction before disappearing behind ice formations approximately 800 meters from Paul's position. Paul reported these observations to Magnus and received instructions to continue monitoring while maintaining his current position. The afternoon progressed with diminishing wildlife activity as temperatures dropped and wind speeds increased slightly. Paul captured additional landscape images and documented the changing light conditions as the sun tracked across the Arctic sky. His position provided excellent views of the surrounding terrain, and he felt confident in his ability to spot any approaching wildlife well before it could pose a danger. At 14:23 hours, Paul noticed movement approximately 1,200 meters to the southwest, not from wildlife, but from the base camp area. Through his telephoto lens, he could see several team members moving around the camp, likely conducting routine maintenance activities or preparing for afternoon observation sessions. The sight of human activity provided a comfortable reminder of civilization and safety in the midst of this pristine wilderness environment. Paul's focus returned to wildlife observation when he spotted a snowy owl perched on an ice formation approximately 600 meters away. The bird provided an excellent photography subject, and Paul spent nearly an hour capturing images that showcased the owl's perfect adaptation to the Arctic environment. The bird's white plumage provided natural camouflage against the snow and ice, making it nearly invisible except when it moved. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Paul started considering his return to base camp. The day had been exceptionally productive, with several portfolio-quality images captured and excellent behavioral documentation completed. His equipment had performed without problems, despite the challenging conditions, and he felt satisfied with the professional and artistic results of the day's work. At 15:41 hours, Paul conducted a final systematic scan of his observation area before beginning to pack his equipment. The telephoto lens revealed no wildlife activity within his extended field of view, and he felt comfortable that the area was clear for his withdrawal to base camp. He began the careful process of packing his expensive equipment, ensuring that each piece was properly protected against the cold and potential impact damage during transport. Paul's equipment packing routine was methodical and thorough, developed over years of working in challenging environments where a single mistake could destroy thousands of dollars worth of irreplaceable gear. Each lens was cleaned and capped before being secured in protective foam within weatherproof cases. Camera bodies were powered down and secured with backup batteries removed to prevent power drainage in the extreme cold. As Paul worked through his packing routine, he maintained peripheral awareness of his surroundings, a habit that had served him well throughout his career. The Arctic environment could change rapidly, and wildlife could appear with little warning. Despite his confidence in the area's security, Paul knew that constant vigilance was the price of safety in polar bear territory. At 16:05 hours, Paul completed his equipment packing and conducted a final area sweep to ensure nothing had been left behind. His backpack, weighing approximately 25 kilograms with all gear secured, was properly balanced for the trek back to base camp. He activated his communication device and reported to Magnus that he was beginning his return journey, with an estimated arrival time of 1635 hours. The return journey began uneventfully, with Paul following the established route across familiar terrain. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the snow and ice, creating dramatic contrasts that Paul appreciated both aesthetically and practically. The enhanced shadows made it easier to identify safe footing and potential hazards in the terrain. Paul had covered approximately half the distance back to base camp when he encountered the first sign that something had changed during his afternoon of focused photography. At 16:21 hours, he noticed fresh tracks in the snow crossing his intended path, large, distinctive paw prints that could only belong to an adult polar bear. The tracks appeared very fresh, with crisp edges and no wind-blown snow accumulation. Paul immediately stopped and activated his communication device, reporting the track discovery to Magnus. While waiting for response, Paul examined the tracks more closely, using skills learned from years of wildlife photography and tracking. The prints measured approximately 30 centimeters in length, with clear claw marks extending beyond the pad impressions, characteristics consistent with a large male polar bear. Magnus responded within moments, confirming Paul's report and instructing him to remain stationary while the base camp team assessed the situation. Paul acknowledged the instruction and began implementing learned safety protocols for potential wildlife encounters. He removed bear spray from his easily accessible pocket position and conducted a systematic scan of his surroundings, paying particular attention to areas where a large animal might seek concealment. The tracks crossed Paul's path at nearly a right angle, heading from northeast to southwest, a direction that would take the bear toward the base camp area. Paul estimated the tracks were no more than 30 minutes old, based on their condition and the current wind patterns. The implications were immediately clear. Bear Alpha, or another large male, had passed very close to Paul's position during the final hour of his photography session. At 16:24 hours, Magnus' radio communication crackled with increased urgency. Eric reported visual contact with a large polar bear approximately 400 meters southwest of Paul's current position, moving in a direction that would intersect with Paul's planned return route. The bear appeared to be the same individual they had designated as Bear Alpha, identifiable by the distinctive ear scarring. Paul acknowledged the report and requested guidance on alternate return routes. Magnus consulted with Dr. Mitchell and Eric before providing instructions for Paul to remain stationary until the bear's movements could be tracked and a safe corridor identified for his return to base camp. Paul confirmed his understanding and settled into a defensive position behind available ice formations. The waiting period began what would become the most critical phase of the day's events. Paul found himself alone on the Arctic tundra with a large polar bear somewhere in his vicinity, relying entirely on radio communication with his support team for situational awareness beyond his immediate visual range. The weight of his professional equipment, which had been merely cumbersome during the day's photography, now represented a potential liability that could slow his movement if rapid retreat became necessary. Through his communication device, Paul could hear the controlled tension in Magnus's voice as the expedition leader coordinated with his team to track the bear's movements and identify safe options for Paul's return. Eric provided periodic updates on the bear's position, reporting that the animal appeared to be following a hunting pattern rather than showing any particular interest in human presence. At 16:31 hours, Dr. Mitchell's voice joined the radio communications with an assessment that Bear Alpha's current behavior patterns suggested the bear was not acting aggressively toward humans, but was simply following established hunting territory routes. The wildlife biologist recommended that Paul remain stationary for an additional 15 minutes while the team confirmed the bear had moved to a safe distance from potential return routes. Paul used the enforced waiting period to conduct detailed observations of his immediate surroundings, identifying potential defensive positions and escape routes should the situation deteriorate. His experience in dangerous wildlife situations had taught him that survival often depended on advanced planning rather than reactive responses to unexpected developments. The Arctic landscape around Paul's position offered limited options for concealment or defensive positioning. Ice formations provided some visual barriers, but would offer little physical protection against a determined polar bear. Paul's best options appeared to be maintaining his current position until support team confirmation of safe travel corridors, or, if necessary, using bear spray and flares to discourage any aggressive approach while falling back toward base camp. At 16:39 hours, Eric reported that Bear Alpha had moved to a position approximately 800 meters south of Paul's location and appeared to be investigating ice formations in that area. The bear's movement pattern suggested continued hunting behavior rather than any territorial response to human presence. Magnus authorized Paul to begin movement toward base camp, using a modified route that would maintain maximum distance from the bear's last known position. Paul acknowledged the authorization and began moving immediately, maintaining constant radio communication with the base team. His modified route required additional travel time, but offered better terrain advantages and multiple fallback positions should unexpected developments occur. The weight of his equipment made rapid movement impossible, but Paul maintained steady progress while continuously scanning for signs of wildlife presence. The tension in Paul's radio communications began to ease as he covered distance toward base camp without incident. Eric continued providing periodic updates on Bear Alpha's position, reporting that the animal remained focused on hunting activities and showed no signs of interest in human movement patterns. Paul's confidence began returning as he recognized familiar landmarks indicating his proximity to the safety of base camp. At 16:52 hours, Paul crested a low ridge that provided visual contact with base camp approximately 600 meters distant. The sight of the bright orange emergency shelter and familiar tent arrangements provided enormous psychological relief after the stress of the previous 30 minutes. Paul reported his visual contact with base camp and received confirmation that his final approach route was clear of wildlife presence. Paul's arrival at base camp at 16:58 hours was met with obvious relief from all team members. Magnus conducted a brief debriefing session while Paul unpacked his equipment and stored it securely. The day's events were documented in the expedition log, including detailed timing and location information that would be valuable for ongoing polar bear behavior research. Dr. Mitchell expressed particular interest in the tracking data, noting that Bear Alpha's movement patterns were consistent with established territorial behavior rather than any abnormal response to human presence. The incident provided valuable documentation of human polar bear spatial interaction in natural conditions, contributing to research understanding of how bears and humans might coexist in shared environments. Lisa conducted a brief stress assessment with Paul, confirming that he had experienced normal adrenaline responses to the wildlife encounter, but showed no signs of lasting distress or impaired judgment. Paul reported feeling exhilarated rather than traumatized by the experience, describing it as a reminder of the wild nature of the environment he loved to photograph. The evening meal preparation proceeded with animated discussion of the day's events. Paul shared some of his best photographs from the morning's successful wildlife documentation, including the impressive hunting sequence that had captured Bear Alpha's predatory skills. The images drew appreciative comments from both amateur and professional photographers in the group. Weather reports for the following day indicated continued favorable conditions, with clear skies and moderate temperatures providing excellent opportunities for additional wildlife photography. Magnus announced plans for a group photography session at a location approximately 3 kilometers east of base camp, where ice formations created natural amphitheaters that were known to attract wildlife. As evening approached, the team completed their standard camp security procedures. All food was secured in bear-proof containers positioned well away from sleeping areas. Perimeter motion sensors were activated and tested to ensure proper functioning. Emergency equipment was inspected and verified, ready for immediate use if needed. Paul retired to his tent at 21:30 hours, feeling satisfied with the day's successful photography and confident in the team's professional approach to safety management. His tent, positioned near the eastern edge of the camp perimeter, provided excellent views of the surrounding landscape while remaining within the camp's security protocols. Paul's tent was a state-of-the-art four-season mountaineering shelter designed for extreme cold conditions. The double-wall construction provided excellent insulation while minimizing condensation problems. Interior space was sufficient for Paul's sleeping system plus essential equipment storage, with enough headroom for comfortable movement during lengthy weather confinements. Paul's evening routine included a final equipment check, ensuring that camera batteries were charging properly and that all electronic devices would be ready for the following day's activities. He reviewed the day's digital images on his camera's LCD screen, confirming that the important behavioral sequences had been captured successfully and identifying the best candidates for immediate editing and transmission to editors via satellite communication. The Arctic night settled over base camp with remarkable clarity. Temperature dropped to -18 degrees Celsius, and aurora borealis activity increased dramatically as darkness deepened. Paul could hear the subtle sounds of camp activity as team members completed their evening routines and settled into their sleeping systems for the night. Paul's sleep came easily, despite the adrenaline residue from the afternoon's wildlife encounter. His sleeping system, rated for temperatures well below the current conditions, maintained comfortable warmth inside his tent. The familiar sounds of Arctic night, wind across ice formations, the occasional crack of expanding or contracting ice, and distant wildlife vocalizations provided a natural symphony that Paul found soothing rather than disturbing. At 2:17 hours, Paul woke to an unusual sound outside his tent. His photographer's instincts, honed by years of wildlife work, immediately recognized the sound as something different from the typical Arctic night ambiance. Paul lay quietly in his sleeping bag, listening carefully to identify what had awakened him. The sound came again, a soft shuffling noise that could have been wind-blown snow against tent fabric. But Paul's experienced ear detected subtle characteristics that suggested something else. Paul had learned to trust his instincts in wildlife situations, and something about this particular sound raised his awareness level from sleeping comfort to wakeful attention. Paul quietly unzipped his sleeping bag and moved into a sitting position, maintaining absolute silence while listening for additional sounds. His movement was carefully controlled to avoid creating any noise that might mask important audio information about conditions outside his tent. Years of photographing sensitive wildlife had taught Paul to move with exceptional stealth when necessary. After several minutes of careful listening, Paul heard no repetition of the unusual sound. He concluded that it had likely been wind-related or possibly one of his teammates moving around camp for personal needs. Paul settled back into his sleeping bag, but maintained a higher level of alertness than he had experienced since settling into the tent. At 2:31 hours, the motion sensor alarm activated with its distinctive electronic beep, a sound designed to alert the camp to potential wildlife presence without being so loud as to panic or disorient awakening personnel. Paul immediately sat up in his sleeping bag, now fully alert and listening for additional information about what had triggered the sensor. Magnus's voice came through the camp communication system within moments of the alarm, providing calm instructions for all personnel to remain in their tents while the situation was assessed. Paul could hear movement in several other tents as team members responded to the alert, but the overall camp response was quiet and disciplined, exactly as they had practiced during safety briefings. Paul quietly moved to his tent entrance and carefully opened the zipper a few centimeters, providing a narrow view of the area immediately outside his tent. The aurora borealis provided sufficient illumination to see general shapes and movement, though details were difficult to distinguish. Paul could see the emergency shelter approximately 20 meters away, but no obvious signs of what had triggered the motion sensor. Eric's voice joined the communication circuit, reporting that he had visual contact with a large animal approximately 50 meters north of the base camp perimeter. The animal appeared to be investigating the area, but had not attempted to approach the camp directly. Eric requested that all personnel remain in their tents while he and Magnus assessed the situation further. Paul remained at his tent entrance, maintaining visual surveillance of his immediate area while listening to radio communications. His tent position on the eastern edge of camp provided good views of potential approach routes, making him a valuable observation point during the assessment period. Paul activated his personal communication device and reported his readiness to provide additional observation information if needed. Dr. Mitchell's voice provided professional assessment of the situation, noting that polar bear curiosity about human camps was normal behavior that rarely escalated to aggressive encounters. The key factors were avoiding sudden movements or loud noises that might startle the animal and ensuring that no food odors or accessible attractants were available to draw the bear closer to camp. At 2:41 hours, Magnus reported that the animal had been positively identified as Bear Alpha, the same individual they had encountered during Paul's return to camp the previous afternoon. The bear appeared to be conducting normal investigative behavior, testing scents and evaluating the area without showing signs of aggressive intent or territorial challenge. Paul found himself in the unique position of observing the same magnificent animal that had provided his best photography opportunities, now encountering the bear under completely different circumstances. The professional appreciation for Bear Alpha's impressive size and obvious intelligence remained, but Paul was now acutely aware that he was observing an apex predator capable of devastating violence if circumstances triggered aggressive behavior. Eric reported that Bear Alpha was moving slowly along the camp perimeter, maintaining a distance of approximately 40 to 50 meters, while conducting what appeared to be routine territorial investigation. The bear's body language showed typical curiosity rather than hunting posture or aggressive stance, which Dr. Mitchell confirmed was consistent with normal polar bear behavior around human settlements. The communication discipline maintained by all team members during the encounter impressed Paul with its professionalism. Despite the obvious tension created by having a 500-kilogram predator investigating their camp in the middle of the night, voices remained calm and informative. Instructions were clear and acknowledged promptly, maintaining the coordinated response necessary for successful wildlife encounter management. At 2:47 hours, Bear Alpha approached to within 30 meters of Paul's tent position. Paul could observe the massive animal clearly through his tent entrance gap, noting details of the bear's physical condition and behavior that would be valuable for both personal experience and professional understanding. The bear moved with fluid grace, despite his enormous size, each step placed with careful precision that demonstrated perfect adaptation to the Arctic environment. Paul found himself holding his breath as Bear Alpha paused directly in front of his tent, separated by less than 30 meters of open ground. The bear's massive head turned slowly as he tested air currents, his sensitive nose gathering detailed information about the strange structures and unfamiliar scents that had appeared in his territory. Paul could see the distinctive scarring around the bear's left ear that had made identification possible during previous encounters. The moment stretched with surreal intensity as Paul observed Bear Alpha from closer range than any of his telephoto photography had achieved. Every detail of the bear's physical presence was magnified. The silver-tipped guard hairs that provided insulation against Arctic cold, the massive paws with their razor-sharp claws, and the intelligent dark eyes that seemed to evaluate everything within their field of view. Bear Alpha's investigation continued for several more minutes, with the animal showing particular interest in the area around the camp's food storage containers. The bear-proof storage system performed exactly as designed, providing no access to the contents despite the bear's obvious strength and persistence. Paul watched the bear's problem-solving behavior with professional fascination, noting the animal's systematic approach to investigating potential food sources. At 2:54 hours, Bear Alpha appeared to lose interest in the camp area and began moving away toward the southeast. Eric tracked the bear's departure through night vision equipment, reporting that the animal was resuming normal hunting behavior patterns rather than showing continued interest in human presence. The immediate threat level began decreasing as Bear Alpha increased his distance from the camp perimeter. Magnus maintained alert status for an additional 15 minutes before declaring the all-clear and authorizing personnel to return to normal sleeping routines. The encounter had lasted approximately 23 minutes from initial motion sensor activation to Bear Alpha's departure from the vicinity. Dr. Mitchell noted the incident timing and behavior details in his research log for later analysis and reporting. Paul remained at his tent entrance for several additional minutes after receiving all-clear authorization, partly from continued alertness and partly from professional appreciation for the extraordinary wildlife encounter he had just experienced. The opportunity to observe Bear Alpha's natural behavior at such close range provided insights that no telephoto photography could achieve. As Paul settled back into his sleeping bag, he reflected on the remarkable contrast between the day's successful photography session and the night's intimate wildlife encounter. Both experiences reinforced his deep appreciation for the Arctic environment and its magnificent apex predator, while simultaneously highlighting the constant potential for danger that made wilderness photography both exhilarating and hazardous. Paul's return to sleep was complicated by residual adrenaline and professional excitement about the close encounter with Bear Alpha. His mind replayed details of the bear's behavior and physical presence, already considering how the experience might influence his future Arctic photography approaches. The encounter provided valuable behavioral observations that would enhance his understanding of polar bear psychology and territorial patterns. Sleep finally returned to Paul at approximately 3:20 hours, though his rest remained somewhat lighter than normal due to increased environmental awareness. His subconscious maintained a higher alert level, processing ambient sounds and environmental changes with more attention than during typical sleep periods. This heightened awareness was a natural response to wildlife encounters that Paul had experienced throughout his career. Paul's final period of sleep was interrupted at 5:45 hours by what he initially interpreted as the normal sounds of camp awakening and morning routine preparation. Magnus typically initiated wake-up procedures around 600 hours, and some team members routinely rose earlier for personal preparation or equipment maintenance. Paul remained in his sleeping bag, enjoying the final minutes of warmth before beginning his own morning routine. The sounds outside Paul's tent continued with increasing intensity, but something about the pattern struck Paul as unusual. Instead of the typical human movement sounds associated with morning camp activities, Paul began to recognize sounds that suggested wildlife presence near his immediate tent area. His professional experience with dangerous wildlife encounters triggered immediate alertness as his mind processed the audio information. Paul moved quietly to his tent entrance and carefully opened a small observation gap in the zipper. The early morning light provided sufficient illumination to see his immediate surroundings clearly, and Paul immediately understood that his situation had changed dramatically from the previous night's controlled wildlife encounter. Bear Alpha had returned to the camp area and was currently investigating the immediate vicinity of Paul's tent. The bear was positioned approximately 15 meters from Paul's tent entrance, close enough that Paul could observe fine details of the animal's physical condition and behavior without optical assistance. Bear Alpha appeared calm and methodical in his investigation, showing no signs of agitation or aggressive posture. However, the proximity meant that Paul's options for response were extremely limited should the situation change. Paul reached slowly for his personal communication device, moving with extreme care to avoid creating any sound or movement that might attract the bear's attention to his tent. His fingers found the device and activated it using tactile controls, bringing the communication circuit online without producing any electronic sounds that might trigger a response from the investigating bear. Paul attempted to contact Magnus using silent text communication rather than voice, typing a brief message explaining his situation and requesting guidance. The message transmission failed immediately, indicating that either the base station was offline or atmospheric conditions were preventing signal propagation. Paul was effectively isolated and unable to alert the support team to his predicament. Bear Alpha's investigation pattern brought him steadily closer to Paul's tent, with each methodical step reducing the buffer distance that provided Paul's only margin of safety. Paul could see the bear's impressive physical details clearly now: the massive shoulder muscles that provided swimming power, the intelligent eyes that missed no detail of his environment, and the enormous paws with claws capable of devastating violence. Paul's training and experience provided clear protocols for his current situation, but implementation required careful timing and absolute precision. Bear spray and emergency flares were accessible in his tent, but their use would require Paul to expose himself outside the tent's protection. Any movement that attracted aggressive attention from Bear Alpha would likely prove fatal, given the close proximity and limited escape options. The bear's investigation brought him to within 10 meters of Paul's tent entrance, close enough that Paul could hear the animal's breathing and observe the subtle body language indicators that might predict behavioral changes. Bear Alpha showed continued curiosity rather than predatory focus, but Paul understood that polar bear behavior could shift rapidly based on unexpected stimuli or perceived threats. Paul remained absolutely motionless in his tent entrance, controlling even his breathing pattern to minimize any sound or movement that might draw Bear Alpha's attention. His years of wildlife photography had taught him exceptional patience and stillness, skills that now served him in the most critical application of his career. Every muscle fiber remained under conscious control as Paul waited for Bear Alpha to complete his investigation and move away from the immediate area. At 6:02 hours, Bear Alpha approached to within 5 meters of Paul's tent, bringing the massive predator close enough that Paul could observe individual whiskers and facial expressions. The bear's investigation had become focused and systematic, suggesting that some aspect of Paul's tent area had attracted particular interest. Paul realized with growing concern that his predicament was escalating rather than resolving naturally. Bear Alpha's investigation appeared to center on scent information, with the bear spending considerable time testing air currents and examining specific areas around Paul's tent. Paul suddenly realized that food residue from his evening meal preparation might be creating attractant scents that were drawing the bear's attention. Despite careful adherence to camp food protocols, some traces of cooking or eating activity might have transferred to Paul's equipment or clothing. The bear's methodology was impressive, even under the current terrifying circumstances. Bear Alpha approached each potential scent source with systematic thoroughness, using his sensitive nose to gather detailed information about the unfamiliar objects and activities that had appeared in his territory. Paul watched with horrified fascination as the predator demonstrated the intelligence and persistence that had made polar bears the Arctic's apex predator for millennia. Paul's options for response were narrowing rapidly as Bear Alpha's investigation brought the animal into immediate contact with Paul's tent guy lines and equipment storage areas. Any sudden movement or sound from within the tent would likely trigger an immediate response from a predator now positioned close enough to reach Paul in a single bound. Paul's survival depended entirely on remaining undetected until Bear Alpha lost interest and moved away. At 6:07 hours, Bear Alpha made direct physical contact with Paul's tent, brushing against the outer wall fabric as he investigated scent traces around the tent's perimeter. Paul felt the tent wall flex inward from the contact, bringing home the reality that only a thin layer of fabric separated him from 500 kilograms of perfectly evolved predator. Paul's heart rate accelerated dramatically, but he maintained absolute physical stillness despite the terror flooding his nervous system. Bear Alpha's investigation continued around Paul's tent perimeter, with the bear's massive form visible as shadows against the tent walls as he moved through the early morning light. Paul tracked the bear's position by sound and visual shadows, maintaining awareness of the predator's location relative to potential escape routes should the situation deteriorate into an active encounter. The tent fabric that had provided comfortable protection against Arctic weather conditions now seemed impossibly fragile as Bear Alpha's investigation brought him into repeated contact with the structure. Paul could hear the bear's claws occasionally scraping against equipment or tent components, each sound a reminder of the devastating weapons that polar bears carried naturally. Paul's grip on his bear spray tightened, though he understood that deployment from inside the tent would likely prove impossible. At 6:11 hours, Bear Alpha's investigation pattern changed dramatically. Instead of the methodical perimeter search that had characterized his behavior, the bear suddenly focused on Paul's tent entrance area with obvious intentionality. Paul realized with growing horror that Bear Alpha had detected his presence inside the tent and was now investigating the human occupant rather than simply exploring unfamiliar objects in his territory. Bear Alpha approached Paul's tent entrance directly, bringing his massive head to within inches of the fabric barrier that provided Paul's only protection. Paul could observe fine details of the bear's facial features and expressions, noting the intelligent evaluation in the dark eyes that seemed to study Paul's hiding place with perfect understanding of what lay inside. Paul's situation had progressed beyond hope of passive resolution. Bear Alpha had clearly identified Paul's presence and was now actively investigating the human intruder in his territory. Paul's training provided specific protocols for this level of encounter, but implementation would require exposing himself to immediate attack while attempting to deploy defensive measures. The odds of successful defense at such close range were minimal. Bear Alpha began manipulating Paul's tent entrance zipper with his claws, demonstrating problem-solving ability that Paul found terrifying in its implications. The bear understood that the tent contained something of interest and was actively working to gain access, rather than simply investigating external surfaces. Paul realized that his concealment was about to be eliminated regardless of his actions. Paul made the decision to attempt proactive response rather than waiting for Bear Alpha to complete tent entry and attack him in the confined space. Paul quietly positioned his bear spray for immediate deployment and prepared emergency flares for backup use. His plan required perfect timing and exceptional accuracy under the worst possible circumstances. At 6:14 hours, Paul heard the tent entrance zipper beginning to separate under Bear Alpha's manipulation. Paul prepared for immediate action, knowing that his survival window was measured in seconds rather than minutes. Paul positioned himself for rapid exit through the tent's rear emergency panel, hoping to gain enough distance for effective bear spray deployment. Bear Alpha successfully opened Paul's tent entrance and thrust his massive head inside, bringing the predator into direct contact with Paul for the first time. Paul found himself face to face with the Arctic's apex predator at a distance of less than 2 meters, observing intelligence and evaluation in the bear's dark eyes that made the encounter even more terrifying than simple predatory aggression would have been. Paul triggered his emergency plan immediately, activating the tent's rear panic exit system while simultaneously deploying bear spray toward Bear Alpha's face and sensitive nose areas. The confined space inside the tent made accurate deployment difficult, and Paul could not determine immediately whether the spray had achieved effective concentration on target areas. Bear Alpha's reaction to the bear spray was immediate and violent. The massive predator recoiled from Paul's tent entrance with obvious pain and disorientation, but his response included aggressive vocalizations that Paul recognized as expressions of anger rather than retreat behavior. Paul realized that his defensive action had succeeded in buying time, but might have escalated the encounter toward active aggression. Paul completed his emergency exit from the tent's rear panel and immediately began implementing evasion protocols while preparing additional defensive measures. His escape route led toward the camp's emergency shelter, but the distance required crossing open ground where Paul would be completely exposed to pursuit by an angry and partially blinded polar bear. Bear Alpha recovered from the bear spray effects more rapidly than Paul had hoped, with the bear's superior physical conditioning and adaptation overcoming the chemical deterrent's impact. Paul could see the massive predator shaking his head and pawing at his face to clear the irritating spray residue, but the bear's attention remained focused on Paul rather than seeking escape from the area. Paul activated emergency flares while moving toward the camp shelter, hoping to create additional deterrent effects and alert other team members to the crisis situation. The bright flares provided illumination and visual distraction, but also clearly revealed Paul's position to Bear Alpha's recovering vision. Paul realized that his defensive actions were proving insufficient against a determined and intelligent predator. Bear Alpha began active pursuit of Paul across the open ground between Paul's tent and the emergency shelter. The bear's speed and agility were devastating, covering ground with powerful strides that eliminated Paul's lead distance in seconds. Paul understood that he could not reach shelter before Bear Alpha caught him and prepared for close contact defense of his life. Paul deployed his remaining bear spray in a sweeping pattern designed to create a chemical barrier between himself and the pursuing predator. The spray created a visible cloud in the cold air, and Paul hoped that the concentration would be sufficient to force Bear Alpha to break off his attack. Paul continued moving toward shelter while maintaining visual contact with the approaching bear. Bear Alpha charged through the bear spray cloud with minimal apparent effect, his momentum and determination carrying him past the chemical deterrent toward direct contact with Paul. Paul realized that his defensive measures had failed and that he was about to experience the full predatory power of the Arctic's most dangerous animal. Paul's survival now depended on factors beyond his control or preparation. The impact of Bear Alpha's attack was beyond anything Paul could have imagined or prepared for. The bear's initial blow struck Paul in the torso with enough force to lift him completely off his feet and send him flying several meters across the frozen ground. Paul's consciousness fragmented as his body absorbed devastating trauma that his brain could not immediately process or understand. Paul's awareness flickered between consciousness and unconsciousness as Bear Alpha continued the attack with methodical violence that demonstrated the predator's efficiency at killing large prey. Paul could feel massive teeth and claws inflicting catastrophic injuries, but shock and trauma prevented clear understanding of the extent of damage being done to his body. Through his fragmenting consciousness, Paul could hear voices and activity from the camp area as other team members responded to the emergency flare signals and obvious sounds of the attack in progress. Paul hoped desperately that help would arrive in time to save his life, but understood that rescue efforts would likely recover his remains rather than providing medical assistance to a survivor. Magnus and Eric reached Paul's position within minutes of the attack beginning, but Bear Alpha had inflicted fatal injuries before effective intervention could be implemented. The rescue team's gunfire drove the bear away from Paul's body, but medical assessment revealed trauma that was beyond the capability of their emergency medical supplies to address. Paul Harrison died from his injuries at 6:23 hours on September 8, 2024. The aftermath of Paul's death created immediate crisis management challenges that tested every aspect of the expedition team's emergency protocols. Magnus coordinated simultaneous efforts to secure the area against continued bear threat, provide what medical assistance might still be possible, document the incident for investigation purposes, and initiate evacuation procedures for the surviving team members. Lisa's medical assessment confirmed that Paul had suffered massive trauma to multiple body systems, with injuries that would have proven fatal even with immediate access to advanced trauma surgery capabilities. The attack had demonstrated the devastating efficiency of polar bear predation, with Bear Alpha inflicting lethal damage within the first minutes of contact, despite Paul's defensive efforts. Dr. Mitchell began immediate documentation of the incident circumstances, recording timeline information, bear behavior observations, and environmental factors that might have contributed to the fatal encounter. His professional assessment indicated that Bear Alpha had displayed atypical behavior in actively pursuing access to Paul's tent and continuing the attack despite defensive chemical deterrence. Eric and Magnus worked together to establish secure perimeter around Paul's remains while assessing Bear Alpha's current location and threat potential to the surviving team members. The bear had withdrawn to approximately 200 meters distance but remained visible in the area, creating ongoing danger for any evacuation or investigation activities. The satellite communication system enabled immediate contact with emergency coordination centers in Longyearbyen and mainland Norway. Magnus provided initial incident reports and requested immediate helicopter evacuation for all surviving team members, with priority medical transport capability in case other injuries had been sustained during the attack or its aftermath. Rebecca Thompson, despite the shock and trauma of witnessing the attack, began professional documentation of the incident from a journalistic perspective. Her training in crisis situations enabled her to function effectively, while others struggled with emotional responses to Paul's death. Her photographs and written documentation would later prove essential for official investigations and legal proceedings. The surviving tourists responded with varying degrees of shock, trauma, and adaptive capability. Dr. Chen provided medical assistance for team members experiencing acute stress reactions, while Michael and Janet Rodriguez struggled with overwhelming fear and disorientation. Klaus Weber focused obsessively on documenting equipment damage and loss, using technical concerns as psychological defense against emotional processing of the tragedy. Weather conditions remained favorable for helicopter evacuation, but aircraft availability and flight planning requirements meant that immediate rescue was not possible. The team faced the prospect of remaining in the area for several additional hours, while maintaining security against a polar bear that had demonstrated willingness to attack humans and might return to investigate the continued presence of potential prey. Bear Alpha's behavior following the attack continued to concern Dr. Mitchell and Eric. Rather than leaving the area after completing the kill, the bear maintained presence at moderate distance, while showing continued interest in the human camp. This pattern differed significantly from typical polar bear behavior after successful predation, suggesting possible behavioral abnormalities or unusual territorial responses. Magnus implemented maximum security protocols for the remaining team members, consolidating everyone into the emergency shelter while maintaining armed watches for continued bear presence. All non-essential equipment was abandoned in favor of focusing resources on survival and evacuation preparation. Paul's photographic equipment, damaged during the attack, was left in place to avoid unnecessary risk exposure. The emergency shelter provided adequate protection and life support for the 19 surviving team members, but psychological conditions deteriorated as the reality of Paul's death and their continued danger became fully apparent. Lisa worked continuously to provide psychological first aid and manage panic responses that threatened group cohesion and survival capability. Communication with rescue coordination centers continued throughout the morning, with updates provided on Bear Alpha's position and behavior patterns. Helicopter dispatch was confirmed for early afternoon arrival, weather permitting, but the evacuation timeline remained dependent on conditions that could change rapidly in the Arctic environment. At 9:15 hours, Bear Alpha approached Paul's remains and began feeding behavior that Dr. Mitchell recognized as typical post-kill consumption patterns. The bear's actions confirmed that Paul had been killed by predatory attack rather than defensive territorial behavior, representing an extremely rare occurrence in human polar bear interactions. Dr. Mitchell's observations would later contribute to research understanding of abnormal polar bear behavior patterns. The feeding behavior continued intermittently throughout the morning hours, with Bear Alpha maintaining possession of Paul's remains while showing continued awareness of the surviving human presence. The bear's territorial behavior prevented any possibility of body recovery operations until professional wildlife management resources could be brought to the area. Magnus made the difficult decision to document Paul's death and Bear Alpha's subsequent behavior through telephoto photography from the emergency shelter. The images, while disturbing, provided essential evidence for investigating the circumstances that led to Paul's death and might contribute to preventing similar incidents in the future. The psychological impact on surviving team members intensified as they observed Bear Alpha's feeding behavior through shelter windows. The reality of Paul's death, combined with their own continued vulnerability, created trauma responses that ranged from catatonic withdrawal to aggressive demands for immediate evacuation, regardless of safety considerations. Dr. Chen and Lisa worked together to provide psychological support and medical monitoring for team members showing signs of acute stress reactions. Several individuals required medication to manage panic attacks and anxiety responses that interfered with their ability to function effectively during the crisis situation. Rebecca Thompson continued her documentation efforts despite personal trauma, recognizing that her professional recording of events might be the only comprehensive account of the incident available for investigation purposes. Her interviews with surviving team members provided detailed timeline information and behavioral observations that would prove essential for understanding how the fatal encounter developed. At 11:30 hours, helicopter rotors became audible in the distance, signaling the arrival of evacuation aircraft that would transport the surviving team members to safety in Longyearbyen. The sound of approaching rescue generated emotional responses ranging from relief to continued anxiety about their exposure during evacuation procedures. The helicopter evacuation required careful coordination to avoid provoking aggressive responses from Bear Alpha, who maintained position near Paul's remains while showing obvious awareness of increased human activity. The aircraft crew included wildlife management specialists equipped to deal with dangerous polar bear situations if intervention became necessary. Evacuation procedures began immediately upon helicopter arrival, with priority given to team members showing signs of medical distress and those with limited cold weather survival experience. The process required multiple aircraft rotations to transport all personnel safely, with each group transfer creating potential exposure to Bear Alpha's continued presence in the area. Magnus and Eric remained with the final evacuation group, maintaining security watch and documenting final observations of Bear Alpha's behavior patterns. Their professional assessment would contribute to wildlife management decisions about the bear's future status and potential threat to other human activities in the region. The final helicopter departure occurred at 14:45 hours, leaving Bear Alpha in possession of the area and Paul's remains. Wildlife authorities would later return with specialized equipment to recover Paul's body and assess Bear Alpha's behavioral status, but immediate priorities focused on ensuring survivor safety and providing medical treatment for trauma responses. The flight to Longyearbyen provided surviving team members with their first sense of security since Paul's attack, but also marked the beginning of intensive investigation and media attention that would continue for months. Each survivor would undergo detailed interviews with wildlife authorities, law enforcement, and insurance investigators seeking to understand how an experienced wildlife photographer had been killed despite extensive safety precautions. Upon arrival in Longyearbyen, surviving team members received immediate medical evaluation and psychological support services. Several individuals required hospitalization for treatment of shock and anxiety reactions, while others needed extended counseling to process the trauma of witnessing Paul's death and their own near-death experience. The media response to Paul's death was immediate and intense, with international news organizations seeking interviews and information about the circumstances of the attack. Rebecca Thompson's professional documentation became essential source material for accurate reporting. Though sensationalized accounts quickly appeared in various media outlets seeking to exploit public fascination with wildlife attacks. Paul's family was notified of his death through official channels before media reports could reach them, but the international attention made private grieving impossible. His parents, Robert and Elena Harrison, faced the double trauma of losing their son and dealing with intense media scrutiny of the circumstances surrounding his death. The investigation into Paul's death involved multiple agencies, including Norwegian wildlife authorities, law enforcement, insurance companies, and international wildlife research organizations. Each group brought different perspectives and priorities to understanding how an experienced professional had been killed, despite following established safety protocols. Dr. Mitchell's research documentation provided essential baseline information about Bear Alpha's behavior patterns and the environmental circumstances leading to the fatal encounter. His observations contradicted initial media speculation that Paul had somehow violated safety protocols or engaged in reckless behavior that precipitated the attack. Magnus and Eric underwent intensive questioning about their safety procedures and the decision-making processes that had allowed Paul to establish an isolated position where bear attack was possible. Their professional reputations and the future of their business depended on demonstrating that all reasonable precautions had been implemented. The surviving tourists provided varied accounts of events leading to Paul's death, with some individuals questioning whether adequate safety measures had been in place, and others defending the expedition leadership's professional competence. These conflicting perspectives complicated investigation efforts and contributed to ongoing legal disputes about responsibility and liability. Wildlife authorities conducted extensive analysis of bear alpha's behavior patterns, seeking to understand whether the attack represented normal polar bear territorial behavior or indicated abnormal aggression that might pose continued threats to human safety. Their findings would determine whether bear alpha would be relocated, monitored, or destroyed as a public safety measure. Paul's equipment, recovered during body retrieval operations, provided additional documentation of events leading to his death. His camera's memory cards contained thousands of images documenting bear alpha's behavior patterns over several days, including detailed photographs that helped investigators understand the bear's territorial ranges and hunting patterns. The images revealed that bear alpha had been observing human activities more closely than anyone had realized, with photographic evidence showing the bear watching the camp from concealed positions during periods when team members believed the area was secure from wildlife presence. This documentation raised serious questions about the effectiveness of current safety protocols for Arctic wildlife photography. Insurance investigations focused on whether Paul's death resulted from negligence, equipment failure, or unavoidable wildlife encounter covered by existing policies. The financial stakes were significant, with potential payouts affecting not only Paul's family, but also the expedition company's continued operation and professional insurance coverage. Legal proceedings developed as Paul's family pursued wrongful death claims against the expedition company, while surviving team members filed suits alleging inadequate safety measures and emotional trauma resulting from witnessing the fatal attack. These cases would take years to resolve and would establish important precedents for wilderness tourism liability. The impact on Arctic wildlife photography extended far beyond the immediate participants, as Paul's death raised questions about safety protocols throughout the professional photography community. Many photographers reconsidered their willingness to work in polar bear territory, while others advocated for enhanced safety measures and support systems. Paul's memorial service was held in Anchorage, with attendance by family, friends, and colleagues from throughout the international wildlife photography community. His work was celebrated as an important contribution to Arctic wildlife documentation, while his death served as a sobering reminder of the risks inherent in wilderness photography. The establishment of the Paul Harrison Memorial Fund provided resources for supporting wildlife photography safety research and training programs. The fund's activities included developing improved safety protocols, supporting emergency response capabilities in remote locations, and providing financial assistance for families of photographers killed in wildlife encounters. Paul's photographic legacy continued through posthumous publication of his Arctic wildlife images, including the final photographs taken during his last expedition. These images provided a haunting reminder of the beauty and danger of Arctic environments, while contributing to ongoing research and conservation efforts. Bear Alpha was ultimately relocated to a remote area of Svalbard, after wildlife authorities determined that his behavioral patterns posed continued risks to human safety. The bear's attack on Paul represented an unusual escalation in human polar bear conflict that required management intervention to prevent additional fatalities. The surviving expedition members dealt with long-term psychological consequences that varied dramatically among individuals. Some developed post-traumatic stress disorders requiring extended treatment, while others found that the experience reinforced their appreciation for wilderness environments despite the inherent dangers. Rebecca Thompson's documentation of Paul's death became the basis for a comprehensive book examining human-wildlife conflict in Arctic environments. Her work contributed to improved understanding of the psychological and practical challenges facing people who choose to work in proximity to dangerous wildlife. Dr. Chen returned to her veterinary practice with enhanced understanding of Arctic wildlife medical needs, applying lessons learned from the expedition to improve treatment protocols for animals affected by climate change and human encroachment on traditional habitats. Michael and Janet Rodriguez never fully recovered from the trauma of witnessing Paul's death, with both developing anxiety disorders that prevented future travel to remote locations. Their experience illustrated the broader psychological costs of wildlife attacks that extend far beyond the immediate victims. Magnus and Eric rebuilt their expedition business with enhanced safety protocols based on lessons learned from Paul's death. Their new procedures included mandatory satellite tracking for all participants, enhanced bear detection systems, and improved emergency response capabilities that set new industry standards. The changes implemented following Paul's death contributed to improved safety records for Arctic wildlife photography expeditions, though the inherent risks of working in proximity to dangerous wildlife could never be completely eliminated. Paul's death served as a catalyst for industry-wide improvements that likely prevented additional fatalities. Klaus Weber abandoned wildlife photography following Paul's death, unable to overcome the psychological trauma of the experience. His technical documentation of the expedition's equipment and procedures provided valuable information for investigation purposes, but marked the end of his involvement in dangerous wildlife photography. Lisa Kowalski developed specialized training programs for medical personnel working in remote wildlife areas, drawing on her experience treating trauma victims in polar bear territory. Her programs became internationally recognized standards for wilderness medical training. The long-term impact of Paul's death extended throughout the international community of wildlife photographers, researchers, and adventure tourists who work in dangerous environments. His death prompted fundamental re-evaluation of risk assessment and safety protocols that continue to evolve as human activities increasingly overlap with wildlife habitats. Paul Harrison's final photographs, taken in the hours before his death, captured Bear Alpha in magnificent detail that illustrated both the beauty and deadly potential of Arctic predators. These images became iconic representations of the complex relationship between humans and wildlife in an era of increasing environmental pressure and habitat loss. The story of Paul's death ultimately transcended the immediate tragedy to become a catalyst for improved understanding of human-wildlife interaction, enhanced safety protocols for dangerous environment photography, and deeper appreciation for the risks accepted by those who document the natural world's most magnificent and dangerous creatures. His legacy lived on through the lives saved by improved safety measures and the continued documentation of Arctic wildlife that his death helped make safer for future generations of photographers and researchers. The next stories: the Whitecap Station incident. Dr. Sarah Chen had always believed that knowledge was humanity's greatest shield against the wild. Standing on the frozen observation deck of Whitecap Research Station, 300 miles north of Churchill, Manitoba, she watched the aurora borealis paint the March sky in ethereal greens and purples. The temperature had dropped to -42 degrees Fahrenheit, and her breath formed crystalline clouds that dissipated instantly in the Arctic wind. "Dr. Chen, we're ready for the live broadcast," called Marcus Rivera, the lead cameraman for Northern Broadcasting Network. His voice carried an edge of excitement mixed with the professional tension that came with remote live television. Marcus had covered stories from war zones to natural disasters, but something about the Arctic's vast emptiness always made him uneasy. Sarah nodded, adjusting the collar of her expedition parka. She had spent the last 6 months at Whitecap Station as part of the International Arctic Climate Consortium, studying the behavioral patterns of polar bears in response to rapidly changing ice conditions. Her research had gained significant attention after she published papers suggesting that polar bears were adapting their hunting strategies in ways that brought them into increasingly dangerous contact with human settlements. The research station itself was a marvel of engineering designed to withstand the harshest conditions on Earth. Built on reinforced steel pylons that elevated it 12 feet above the permafrost, Whitecap Station consisted of 3 interconnected modular buildings arranged in a triangular formation. The main laboratory occupied the largest structure, while the living quarters and communications center rounded out the complex. A network of heated walkways connected all 3 buildings, though most researchers preferred the underground tunnel system during the worst weather. Dr. James Holloway, the station director and Sarah's research partner, emerged from the communications building carrying a steaming mug of coffee. At 58, James had spent nearly 3 decades studying Arctic wildlife, and his weathered face bore the marks of countless expeditions. His grey beard was perpetually frosted with ice during outdoor work, giving him the appearance of a modern-day Arctic explorer. The satellite uplink is stable, James announced, his words creating small puffs of vapor. NBN should have a clear signal for the next 40 minutes before the next orbital window closes. Sarah had agreed to the live television interview reluctantly. She preferred the quiet solitude of research to the glare of media attention, but funding for Arctic research required public awareness and government support. The interview was scheduled to highlight their recent findings about polar bear behavior patterns and climate adaptation strategies. Jennifer Walsh, the NBN field reporter assigned to the story, reviewed her notes one final time. At 34, Jennifer had built her reputation covering environmental stories across Canada's most remote regions. She had reported from oil spill sites in the Arctic Ocean, followed researchers tracking caribou migrations across the tundra, and documented the impact of climate change on Indigenous communities. Yet something about this assignment felt different. The isolation of Whitecap Station was unlike anything she had experienced. "The bears have been more active than usual this season," Sarah explained as the crew made final preparations. "We've documented 17 different individuals within a 20-mile radius of the station. That's nearly triple the typical population density for this area." Technical coordinator David Park monitored multiple screens showing camera angles, audio levels, and satellite signal strength. David had worked with NBN for 12 years, and his expertise with remote broadcasting equipment had taken him to locations around the globe. The Arctic presented unique challenges. Equipment failures were common in extreme cold, and backup systems were essential for any operation more than a few hours from civilization. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the station's wildlife biologist, checked the perimeter monitoring system one final time. The network of motion sensors and infrared cameras provided early warning of approaching wildlife, particularly polar bears. Eleanor had insisted on additional security measures after recent encounters with increasingly bold bears that showed little fear of human presence. "Sensor grid is active," Elena reported through her radio. "All zones showing clear, but remember, polar bears can move faster than our detection systems can track them across open ice." The temperature continued to drop as evening approached. Weather monitoring equipment registered wind gusts up to 35 miles per hour, creating wind chill factors that would cause exposed skin to freeze within minutes. Despite the brutal conditions, the research team had established routines that allowed them to work effectively in one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. Marcus positioned his primary camera on a stable tripod, with secondary handheld units ready for additional angles. The main shot would capture Sarah with the vast Arctic landscape stretching endlessly behind her, creating a dramatic backdrop for the interview. Auxiliary lighting equipment battled the fading daylight and harsh shadows created by the station's structures. "Dr. Chen, can you give us a quick audio check?" Jennifer requested, adjusting her own microphone system. The wireless units had to be specially adapted for extreme cold operations, with battery packs kept warm against the body and transmitters housed in insulated cases. Sarah cleared her throat and spoke into the microphone clipped to her parka. "Testing 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me clearly?" "Perfect," David confirmed from his monitoring station. "Signal strength is excellent, and we have clear video from all camera positions." As the crew completed their technical preparations, Sarah reflected on the research that had brought her to this remote corner of the world. Her doctoral work at the University of Calgary had focused on predator-prey relationships in changing ecosystems, but it wasn't until she joined the Arctic Consortium that she truly understood the complexity of polar bear behavior. Unlike their portrayal in popular media as mindless killing machines, polar bears were incredibly intelligent predators with sophisticated hunting strategies. They could track seals beneath ice sheets from distances of several miles, using their extraordinary sense of smell to detect breathing holes that might not be visible to human observers. Recent changes in ice patterns had forced bears to adapt their behaviors in ways that brought them into contact with human activity more frequently than ever before. 60 seconds to broadcast," Jennifer announced, her professional demeanor masking the nervousness she felt whenever going live from remote locations. Technical failures during live broadcasts could end careers, and the Arctic's harsh conditions made equipment malfunctions a constant threat. Dr. Holloway retreated to the communications center to monitor the broadcast and maintain contact with the station's other personnel. 3 additional researchers were working inside the laboratory complex, analyzing data collected over the past week. Graduate student Michael Torres was processing ice core samples, while Dr. Anna Lindqvist reviewed satellite imagery tracking bear movements across the region. The research station's emergency protocols were comprehensive, developed through years of experience operating in one of the world's most dangerous environments. Multiple communication systems provided redundant contact with the outside world, while emergency supplies could sustain the full crew for 6 weeks if evacuation became impossible. Medical equipment included trauma treatment capabilities and a fully stocked pharmacy, though serious injuries would require helicopter evacuation to Churchill or Winnipeg. 30 seconds, Jennifer called out, her breath visible in the frigid air despite the heated area created by the broadcast equipment. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the cold air burn slightly in her lungs. She had rehearsed her key talking points, focusing on the practical implications of their research for northern communities and wildlife management policies. The data they had collected painted a complex picture of adaptation and survival in a rapidly changing ecosystem. The red recording light activated on Marcus's primary camera, and Jennifer looked directly into the lens with practiced confidence. "Good evening, I'm Jennifer Walsh, reporting live from Whitecap Research Station in the heart of the Canadian Arctic, where temperatures have plummeted to minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm here with Dr. Sarah Chen, whose groundbreaking research on polar bear behavior is changing our understanding of how these magnificent predators are adapting to climate change." Sarah smiled slightly, the expression somewhat stiff due to the extreme cold. "Thank you for having me, Jennifer. It's incredible to be able to share our work with viewers across Canada. Dr. Chen, your recent publications have suggested that polar bear behavior is changing in response to shifting ice patterns. Can you explain what you've observed here at Whitecap Station?" "Absolutely," Sarah began, her words creating small clouds of vapor that dissipated quickly in the Arctic wind. Over the past 6 months, we've documented behavioral patterns that differ significantly from historical observations. Bears are spending more time on land, traveling greater distances between hunting areas and showing increased boldness around human activity. As Sarah spoke, she unconsciously gestured toward the vast landscape behind her, where miles of snow-covered tundra stretched to the horizon. The setting sun cast long shadows across the ice, creating a landscape that seemed both beautiful and threatening. "What does this mean for northern communities?" Jennifer asked, following her prepared questions while monitoring Sarah's responses for unexpected angles. "The implications are significant," Sarah replied. "As bears adapt their hunting strategies, they're more likely to encounter human settlements, research stations, and industrial facilities. Understanding these behavioral changes is crucial for developing effective safety protocols and wildlife management strategies." David monitored the technical aspects of the broadcast from his equipment station, watching multiple screens that displayed camera feeds, audio levels, and satellite signal strength. The remote location presented constant challenges. Equipment had to be specially modified for extreme cold operations, and backup systems were essential given their distance from technical support. "The bears we're tracking show remarkable intelligence in their adaptation strategies," Sarah continued. "They're learning to exploit new food sources and modify their denning behaviors in response to changing ice conditions." Marcus adjusted his camera angle slightly, capturing both Sarah and Jennifer in the frame while maintaining the dramatic Arctic backdrop. His experience with remote broadcasts had taught him to anticipate equipment issues and prepare multiple shooting scenarios for various technical contingencies. Elena monitored the perimeter detection systems from inside the laboratory complex, watching displays that showed the status of motion sensors and infrared cameras positioned around the station. The security network provided early warning of approaching wildlife, particularly important given the recent increase in polar bear activity in the area. "Dr. Chen, you mentioned increased boldness around human activity. Can you elaborate on what that means in practical terms?" Jennifer asked, her journalistic instincts probing for specifics that would resonate with viewers. Sarah paused momentarily, considering how to explain complex behavioral patterns in accessible terms. "Polar bears are naturally curious and intelligent animals. In the past, they typically avoided human settlements and activities. However, we're seeing bears that show little fear of human presence, investigating research equipment, and even approaching occupied structures. Have you had close encounters with polar bears here at Whitecap Station?" "Yes, several times," Sarah admitted. "Just last week, a large male approached within 50 meters of our main laboratory. Our monitoring systems detected his presence, and we followed safety protocols by remaining indoors until he moved away." As Sarah spoke about their recent bear encounters, none of the broadcast team noticed the massive form moving across the ice approximately 200 meters from their position. The polar bear, a mature male weighing nearly 800 pounds, had been tracking the scents and sounds emanating from the research station for the past hour. Polar bears possess extraordinarily acute senses, particularly their sense of smell, which can detect seals beneath ice from distances of several miles. The combination of human activity, electronic equipment, and food odors from the research station created a complex scent signature that had attracted the bear's attention. Unlike the bears Sarah had described in her research, this particular individual showed no hesitation in approaching human activity. His behavior patterns suggested a bear that had previously encountered humans and associated them with potential food sources, a dangerous combination that wildlife experts recognized as a significant threat indicator. What safety measures do you take when working in polar bear territory? Jennifer continued with her interview questions, unaware of the approaching danger. We maintain constant communication with team members, never work alone outdoors, and always carry emergency signaling devices, Sarah explained. The station's perimeter monitoring system provides early warning of approaching wildlife, giving us time to secure ourselves indoors. David noticed a slight fluctuation in one of the perimeter sensor readings, but dismissed it as wind-induced interference. The harsh Arctic conditions frequently caused minor glitches in the electronic monitoring systems, and the fluctuation was within normal parameters for high wind conditions. The approaching polar bear moved with the fluid efficiency of a perfect predator. Despite his massive size, his movements were nearly silent across the snow-covered terrain. His black nose tested the air constantly, analyzing the complex mixture of scents that drew him toward the human activity. Eleanor reviewed the sensor data from her monitoring station inside the laboratory, noting several minor anomalies in the perimeter detection grid. The harsh weather conditions often caused false readings, particularly when blowing snow interfered with infrared sensors. She made a mental note to recalibrate the system after the broadcast concluded. Dr. Chen, what would you say to viewers who might be concerned about the safety of researchers working in such remote and dangerous conditions? Jennifer asked, her professional curiosity driving her to explore the human element of the story. Sarah smiled more genuinely this time, her passion for the research evident despite the brutal conditions. Every scientific endeavor involves calculated risks. We take extensive precautions and have comprehensive emergency procedures. The knowledge we gain here is crucial for understanding how Arctic ecosystems are responding to climate change. Marcus noticed movement in his peripheral vision and instinctively panned his secondary camera toward the edge of the research station compound. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the endless expanse of snow and ice that characterized the Arctic landscape. The movement could have been blowing snow or shadows created by the station's structures. The work you're doing here will have implications far beyond the Arctic, Jennifer observed, steering the conversation toward the broader environmental implications of the research. Exactly, Sarah agreed. Polar bears are an indicator species for Arctic ecosystem health. Changes in their behavior patterns reflect broader environmental changes that affect global climate systems. The polar bear had closed to within 100 meters of the broadcast location, moving with patient determination. His behavior displayed none of the typical wariness that characterized most wild bear encounters with humans. Instead, he showed the bold curiosity of an animal that had learned to associate human activity with potential food sources. Dr. Holloway monitored the interview from the communications center, simultaneously maintaining contact with other research stations across the Arctic network. The live broadcast represented an important opportunity to showcase their work to a national audience, potentially influencing funding decisions and policy development. What are your long-term research goals here at Whitecap Station? Jennifer asked, working through her prepared questions while managing the technical challenges of conducting a live interview in extreme conditions. We're planning to expand our behavioral monitoring program and establish additional research sites across the Arctic archipelago, Sarah explained. The data we're collecting will help develop predictive models for bear-human interactions as climate change continues to alter Arctic ecosystems. Elena noticed a more significant anomaly in the perimeter sensor array, multiple sensors showing activation patterns that suggested a large object moving across the detection grid. Her years of experience with polar bear monitoring told her to take such readings seriously, even when they might be caused by equipment malfunctions. David, Eleanor radioed to the broadcast coordinator, I'm seeing some unusual readings on the perimeter sensors. Probably equipment issues, but I want to verify the area is clear. David acknowledged Elena's transmission, but was focused primarily on maintaining the live broadcast connection. The satellite uplink required constant monitoring, and any interruption could end the interview prematurely. The polar bear paused approximately 75 meters from the broadcast setup, his massive head raised to test the air currents. The wind patterns carried the sense of human activity directly to him, a complex mixture of exhaled breath, equipment lubricants, and synthetic materials that comprised modern Arctic clothing and gear. Marcus repositioned his handheld camera to capture a wider angle of Sarah and Jennifer, inadvertently including more of the background area in his field of view. The professional lighting equipment created a pool of brightness that contrasted sharply with the gathering darkness of the Arctic evening. Dr. Chen, before we conclude, what message would you like to share with Canadians about the importance of Arctic research? Jennifer asked, preparing to wrap up the interview. Sarah looked directly into the camera, her expression serious despite the extreme cold. The Arctic is changing faster than any other region on Earth. The research we conduct here today will determine how effectively we can adapt to and mitigate the impacts of climate change on both wildlife and human communities. Elena's concern about the perimeter sensor readings prompted her to activate the station's external camera system for a visual verification of the area around the broadcast location. The infrared cameras could detect heat signatures through darkness and blowing snow, providing a reliable check on potential wildlife encounters. The polar bear resumed his approach, moving with increased confidence as the human sense grew stronger. His behavior indicated a bear that had overcome the natural wariness that typically kept polar bears away from human activity. Such bears were classified as extremely dangerous by wildlife management authorities. Thank you, Dr. Chen, for sharing your insights with us tonight, Jennifer said, beginning her closing remarks. This has been Jennifer Walsh, reporting live from Whitecap Research Station in the Canadian Arctic, where scientists are working to understand one of our planet's most remarkable predators. As Jennifer concluded her remarks, Elena's external camera system detected the unmistakable heat signature of a large animal moving directly toward the broadcast location. The infrared image clearly showed the distinctive outline of an adult polar bear less than 50 meters from the interview setup. Emergency alert, Elena's voice crackled over the radio system. Large polar bear approaching broadcast location from the northeast. Immediate evacuation required. The warning came too late. The polar bear, driven by curiosity and possibly attracted by the lights and activity of the broadcast, emerged from behind a snowdrift directly behind Sarah and Jennifer. His massive form was clearly visible in the camera's field of view, though the interview participants had not yet noticed his presence. Marcus, monitoring his camera feed, saw the bear first and felt his blood freeze despite the Arctic cold. Training and professionalism warred with human instinct as he realized he was filming what could become a tragedy. His hand moved instinctively toward the radio to warn the others, but he also knew that sudden movements or loud sounds could trigger an attack. David saw the bear simultaneously on his monitor and immediately activated the emergency alert system. Warning signals began flashing throughout the research station complex, alerting all personnel to the presence of dangerous wildlife. The protocols they had practiced dozens of times were now being implemented under actual emergency conditions. "Don't move," Marcus whispered urgently, his voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the Arctic stillness. "Bear behind you." Sarah felt her heart rate spike as she processed Marcus's warning. Years of Arctic safety training had taught her that polar bears were among the most dangerous predators on Earth, particularly males during the spring season. Any sudden movement could trigger a predatory response that would prove fatal. Jennifer's journalistic instincts told her to continue the broadcast. This was potentially the story of a lifetime. but her human survival instincts screamed at her to run, despite knowing that flight would trigger the bear's pursuit response. Polar bears could run up to 35 miles per hour across ice and snow, making escape impossible. The polar bear paused approximately 20 meters behind the interview setup, his massive head swaying as he analyzed the scene before him. His black eyes, perfectly adapted for Arctic conditions, studied the humans and their equipment with intelligent consideration. The bear's body language showed alertness, but not immediate aggression. He was evaluating the situation. Dr. Holloway burst from the communications center, carrying one of the station's emergency flare guns. Arctic safety protocols required multiple deterrent options for polar bear encounters, including noisemakers, flares, and as a last resort, firearms. His years of experience in polar bear country had taught him that bears often retreated when confronted with unfamiliar stimuli. Elena emerged from the laboratory complex, carrying the station's emergency beacon and radio equipment. If the situation escalated, she would need to contact emergency services in Churchill and potentially coordinate helicopter evacuation for injured personnel. The nearest medical facilities were over 300 miles away, making any serious injury potentially fatal. The polar bear took several steps closer, his massive paws making virtually no sound on the packed snow. Adult male polar bears could weigh up to 1,200 pounds, with claws up to 4 inches long and jaws capable of crushing seal skulls with ease. This particular bear appeared to be in excellent physical condition, suggesting successful adaptation to the changing Arctic environment. "Stay absolutely still," Sarah whispered to Jennifer, her voice barely audible. "Don't look directly at him." "Avoid eye contact." Marcus continued filming, his professional training overriding his fear. The footage would provide valuable documentation of polar bear behavior, assuming anyone survived to analyze it. His hands remained steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. The bear approached to within 15 meters, well inside the critical distance where retreat options became severely limited. His massive size was fully apparent now. Standing on his hind legs, he would tower over 8 feet tall. His thick coat appeared almost yellow against the white snow, and his black nose glistened with moisture from constantly testing the air. Dr. Holloway positioned himself where he could clearly see the bear, while maintaining access to the research station buildings. The emergency protocols called for a coordinated response that would provide maximum deterrent effect while maintaining escape routes for all personnel. "I'm going to fire a warning flare," Holloway announced quietly over the radio system. "Everyone be ready to move to the nearest building on my signal." The polar bear's behavior remained unpredictable. His head movement suggested intense curiosity rather than immediate predatory intent, but polar bears were known to switch from curiosity to aggression within seconds. The bear's previous encounters with humans had apparently reduced his natural wariness, creating an extremely dangerous situation. Elena coordinated with emergency services via satellite communication, providing their exact coordinates and situation assessment. The nearest emergency response capabilities were limited by weather conditions and distance, meaning the research team would need to manage the encounter using their own resources and training. "Rescue Coordination Center acknowledges our situation," Elena reported quietly. "Weather conditions prevent immediate helicopter response. We're on our own until morning." The wind picked up slightly, causing the broadcast equipment to sway and creating additional noise that seemed to further interest the polar bear. His ears rotated toward each new sound, and his posture remained alert, but not overtly threatening. The bear appeared to be trying to understand the unusual collection of objects and humans he had encountered. Sarah felt sweat forming beneath her Arctic clothing despite the brutal cold. Her research had taught her that polar bears were incredibly intelligent predators, capable of problem-solving and learning from previous experiences. This bear's boldness suggested he had encountered humans before and learned to associate them with potential benefits rather than threats. Jennifer maintained her professional composure despite the terror she felt. Her experience covering dangerous situations had taught her to suppress panic and focus on survival priorities. The live broadcast continued transmitting, though she had stopped speaking when the bear's presence became apparent. The polar bear moved closer still, now less than 10 meters from the interview setup. His massive head lowered as he investigated the electronic equipment, his black nose testing each new scent carefully. The bear's intelligence was evident in his systematic exploration of the unfamiliar objects. Marcus realized that his camera footage was being broadcast live to thousands of viewers across Canada. The real-time documentation of a polar bear encounter represented unprecedented footage of predator behavior, assuming the situation didn't escalate to tragedy. Dr. Holloway made the decision to deploy the warning flare, hoping to startle the bear into retreating without triggering an aggressive response. His finger moved to the flare gun's trigger as he calculated the optimal firing angle to maximize deterrent effect while minimizing the risk of accidentally hitting the bear and enraging him. The flare arced over the polar bear's head, exploding in a brilliant red flash approximately 30 meters beyond the interview site. The sudden light and noise caused the bear to rear back on his hind legs, his massive form towering over the human figures below. For a moment, it appeared the deterrent had worked, but instead of retreating, the polar bear's curiosity seemed to intensify. The flare had provided additional stimulus that engaged his interest rather than frightening him away. His behavior suggested a bear that had overcome his natural fear responses through previous encounters with human activity. "That didn't work," Holloway muttered into his radio. "Preparing second flare." The polar bear dropped back to all fours and approached even closer, now less than 5 meters from Sarah and Jennifer. His massive size was overwhelming at such close range. His head alone was larger than a human torso, and his powerful shoulders and legs spoke to his status as one of Earth's apex predators. Eleanor activated the station's emergency lighting system, flooding the area with additional illumination. The sudden brightness caused the bear to pause momentarily, but he quickly adapted to the new conditions and continued his investigation of the human activity. Sarah could smell the bear now, a wild, musky scent mixed with the cold Arctic air. His breathing was visible in the frigid atmosphere, great clouds of vapor that spoke to his massive lung capacity and physical power. Every instinct told her to run, but her training held her motionless. The polar bear extended his neck towards Sarah, his black nose approaching within inches of her face. The moment stretched endlessly as predator and human regarded each other across an evolutionary gulf that separated hunter from prey. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she fought to remain perfectly still. Jennifer watched in fascination and terror as the massive predator investigated her colleague. The bear's behavior showed none of the aggressive posturing typically associated with territorial displays or predatory attacks. Instead, he seemed genuinely curious about these unusual creatures he had encountered. Marcus continued filming, his professional instincts overriding his human fear. The footage would provide invaluable documentation of polar bear behavior, regardless of the encounter's outcome. His hands remained remarkably steady, despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Dr. Holloway positioned himself for a second flare deployment, calculating the optimal trajectory to create maximum deterrent effect. The bear's continued approach suggested that traditional deterrent methods might prove ineffective against an animal that had lost his natural wariness of humans. The polar bear's investigation of Sarah intensified as he detected the complex mixture of scents emanating from her clothing and equipment. Human sweat, synthetic materials, and equipment lubricants created an olfactory signature unlike anything in his natural environment. Elena maintained constant communication with emergency services, providing real-time updates on the situation's development. The Rescue Coordination Center was preparing multiple response options, though weather conditions and distance severely limited immediate intervention capabilities. "He's not showing aggressive behavior," Sarah whispered barely audibly, "but that could change instantly." The polar bear moved around the interview setup, systematically investigating each piece of equipment and each human present. His movements were fluid and graceful despite his massive size, demonstrating the physical capabilities that made polar bears such effective predators. Jennifer felt the bear's breath on her neck as he investigated her from behind. The sensation of having 800 pounds of predator breathing down on her was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Professional composure warred with primal terror as she fought to remain motionless. The broadcast continued transmitting live footage of the encounter to viewers across Canada. Network executives were undoubtedly struggling with the decision to continue coverage or cut away from a situation that could turn tragic within seconds. Marcus adjusted his camera angle to capture the full scope of the encounter, his professional training providing a framework for action even in the face of mortal danger. The footage would represent either remarkable documentation of polar bear behavior or tragic evidence of a predatory attack. Dr. Holloway waited for the optimal moment to deploy his second deterrent flare, hoping to convince the bear to retreat before the situation escalated beyond their ability to manage. His years of Arctic experience had taught him to read bear body language, and this animal's behavior remained unpredictable. The polar bear's curiosity seemed to focus particularly on the electronic equipment, perhaps attracted by the electromagnetic signatures or unusual sounds produced by the broadcast gear. His investigation became more thorough as he tested each piece of unfamiliar technology. Elena coordinated defensive preparations with the other research station personnel, ensuring that emergency medical supplies were readily available and evacuation routes remained clear. The station's emergency protocols had been developed for exactly this type of encounter, though the live broadcast complicated standard response procedures. Sarah felt the bear's massive paw brush against her leg as he continued his investigation. The casual contact demonstrated the enormous disparity in size and strength between predator and human. A playful swipe from those claws could prove fatal to a human being. The wind shifted slightly, carrying new scents toward the polar bear and apparently providing additional information that influenced his behavior. His head turned toward the research station buildings, perhaps detecting food odors or other attractants that suggested potential benefits from this unusual encounter. Jennifer watched the bear's body language for any signs of escalating aggression, drawing on her experience covering wildlife stories to interpret the animal's intentions. The bear's behavior remained curious rather than predatory, but polar bears were known for sudden behavioral changes that could prove fatal. The polar bear reared up on his hind legs again, his massive form towering over the human figures below. From this position, he could survey the entire research station complex and assess the broader situation. His intelligence was evident in the systematic way he gathered information about his environment. Marcus realized that the live broadcast footage was creating an unprecedented record of polar bear behavior. Wildlife researchers would analyze every frame of the encounter, potentially providing insights into predator psychology and human-wildlife interaction patterns. Dr. Holloway prepared to deploy multiple deterrent devices simultaneously, hoping that a coordinated barrage of unfamiliar stimuli would convince the bear to retreat. The emergency protocols called for escalating deterrent measures if individual methods proved ineffective. The polar bear dropped back to all fours and began moving toward the research station buildings, apparently losing interest in the human figures and electronic equipment. His massive form moved with surprising grace across the snow-covered terrain as he investigated this new aspect of the human installation. Eleanor tracked the bear's movements through the perimeter sensor network, coordinating with other station personnel to ensure that all entry points to the buildings remained secure. The bear's continued presence created ongoing danger for anyone who needed to move between structures. Sarah felt a wave of relief as the polar bear's attention shifted away from the interview participants, but she knew the encounter was far from over. Polar bears were known to linger in areas where they detected potential food sources, and the research station would continue to attract his attention. The bear approached the main laboratory building, standing on his hind legs to investigate windows and external equipment. His massive paws left clear prints in the snow, providing evidence of his size and confirming the identity of the individual bear for future tracking purposes. Jennifer maintained her position, knowing that any movement could re-attract the bear's attention. The professional requirements of covering the story conflicted with basic survival instincts, creating a psychological tension that tested her emotional reserves. Marcus continued documenting the encounter, recognizing that the footage represented a unique opportunity to observe polar bear behavior in a semi-controlled environment. The bear's boldness provided insights into how these predators were adapting to increased human activity in Arctic regions. Dr. Holloway coordinated with Elena to track the bear's movements and maintain situational awareness throughout the research station complex. The animal's continued presence required constant vigilance and preparation for potential escalation if the bear's behavior changed. The polar bear's investigation of the laboratory building revealed his remarkable problem-solving abilities as he tested various features of the structure. His behavior demonstrated the intelligence that made polar bears such successful predators and such dangerous neighbors for human installations. Elena monitored communications with emergency services, providing regular updates on the situation's development. The Rescue Coordination Center was preparing multiple contingency plans, though immediate intervention remained impossible due to weather conditions and distance. "He's showing exploratory behavior rather than predatory patterns," Sarah whispered into her radio. "But we need to remain extremely cautious. Polar bears can switch behavioral modes very rapidly." The bear spent several minutes investigating the laboratory building before moving toward the communication center where Dr. Holloway was positioned. The encounter had now extended well beyond typical polar bear-human interactions, suggesting an animal with unusual tolerance for human presence. Jennifer recognized that the live broadcast had captured unprecedented footage of polar bear behavior, potentially providing valuable research data while simultaneously documenting a life-threatening encounter. The professional and personal implications of the situation created complex emotional responses. Marcus adjusted his equipment to maintain visual contact with the bear as the animal moved around the research station complex. The technical challenges of filming in extreme cold while managing personal safety created unique professional demands. Dr. Holloway prepared additional deterrent options as the polar bear approached his position. Years of Arctic experience had taught him that bears often tested multiple escape routes and food sources before committing to specific behaviors, making prediction difficult. The polar bear paused outside the communications center, apparently detecting Dr. Holloway's presence inside the building. The bear's acute hearing and sense of smell provided detailed information about human activity, even through insulated walls and barriers. Elena coordinated lockdown procedures for all research station buildings, ensuring that exterior access points were secure and that emergency supplies were readily available. The bear's continued presence created ongoing safety concerns for all personnel. Sarah began moving very slowly toward the nearest building, hoping to reduce her exposure while the bear's attention was focused elsewhere. Arctic safety training emphasized that gradual movement was often safer than remaining completely stationary during extended encounters. The polar bear's behavior at the communications center suggested intelligent assessment of the structure and its contents. His systematic investigation demonstrated problem-solving capabilities that exceeded simple curiosity about unfamiliar objects or scents. Jennifer followed Sarah's example, beginning a careful retreat toward the research station buildings. Professional obligations conflicted with survival instincts, but the live broadcast had already captured extraordinary footage of the encounter. Marcus continued filming while slowly repositioning his equipment, balancing documentation requirements with personal safety considerations. The footage would provide valuable research data regardless of the encounter's ultimate outcome. Dr. Holloway maintained visual contact with the polar bear through reinforced windows, ready to deploy additional deterrent measures if the animal's behavior escalated toward aggression. The bear's persistence suggested an individual that had learned to associate human installations with potential benefits. The bear moved away from the communications center and began investigating the elevated walkways that connected the research station buildings. His massive size made the human-scaled infrastructure appear fragile and inadequate for containing such a powerful predator. Elena tracked the bear's movements through multiple monitoring systems, coordinating with emergency services to provide real-time intelligence about the situation's development. The bear's behavioral patterns were being documented for future wildlife management reference. Sarah reached the relative safety of the main laboratory building, though she knew that polar bears were capable of breaking through most barriers if sufficiently motivated. The building's reinforced construction provided psychological comfort rather than absolute security. The polar bear tested the structural integrity of the elevated walkways by placing his weight on various support elements. His investigation revealed engineering capabilities that suggested learned behavior from previous encounters with human infrastructure. Jennifer joined Sarah at the laboratory building, both women maintaining visual contact with the bear while seeking shelter from the Arctic wind. The interview that had begun as routine science communication had evolved into a life-threatening wildlife encounter. Marcus established a new filming position that provided comprehensive coverage while maintaining a safe distance from the bear's continuing investigation. The technical and personal challenges of the situation tested his professional capabilities and emotional reserves. Dr. Holloway emerged from the communications center, carrying additional deterrent devices and coordinating with Elena to implement comprehensive safety measures. The bear's extended presence required sustained vigilance and preparation for multiple contingencies. The polar bear's behavior continued to demonstrate intelligence and adaptability as he systematically explored every aspect of the human installation. His investigation patterns suggested learned behavior from previous encounters with Arctic research facilities or industrial installations. Elena maintained constant communication with rescue coordination centers, providing detailed updates on weather conditions, personnel status, and bear behavior patterns. The information would inform emergency response planning and future wildlife management policies. The bear is showing sustained interest in the facility rather than moving on, Elena reported via satellite communication. This suggests either strong attractants or learned behavior patterns that associate human installations with benefits. Sarah observed the bear's continued investigation with both scientific fascination and personal terror. The encounter provided unprecedented opportunities to study polar bear behavior, assuming all personnel survived to analyze the data. The bear approached the main laboratory building where Sarah and Jennifer had taken shelter, standing on his hind legs to investigate windows and external equipment at the human-occupied structure. His proximity to the building's occupants created immediate danger despite the barriers. Jennifer felt the building vibrate slightly as the massive predator tested structural elements near their position. The realization that only constructed barriers separated them from 800 pounds of apex predator created psychological stress that challenged her professional composure. Marcus documented the bear's systematic investigation of the laboratory building, recognizing that the footage captured extraordinary examples of polar bear problem-solving behavior. The scientific value of the documentation balanced against the personal danger of the situation. Dr. Holloway coordinated with Elena to prepare coordinated deterrent deployment if the bear's behavior escalated toward attempts to breach the building's barriers. Multiple deterrent systems provided options for managing various escalation scenarios. The polar bear's investigation of the laboratory building revealed his remarkable sensory capabilities as he detected and analyzed complex chemical signatures from scientific equipment and human occupancy. His behavior demonstrated adaptation to industrial environments that exceeded typical wildlife responses. Elena monitored weather conditions that would affect potential evacuation or rescue operations, coordinating with emergency services to maintain situational awareness. The harsh Arctic environment limited response options, while simultaneously creating the conditions that brought polar bears into contact with human installations. Sarah felt the building shake more noticeably as the bear's investigation intensified, testing windows, doors, and structural elements with increasing persistence. The encounter had evolved beyond casual curiosity toward active investigation of potential entry points. The polar bear's behavior at the laboratory building suggested learning from previous experiences with similar structures. His systematic approach to testing barriers and investigating entry points demonstrated problem-solving capabilities that posed serious threats to human safety. Jennifer recognized that their situation had evolved from dangerous encounter to potential siege scenario, with the bear showing sustained interest in gaining access to the building's occupants. Professional documentation requirements conflicted with basic survival priorities. Marcus adjusted his filming position to capture the bear's investigation techniques while maintaining personal safety. Recognizing that the footage documented unprecedented examples of polar bear adaptive behavior in response to human infrastructure. Dr. Holloway prepared comprehensive deterrent deployment, coordinating with Elena to implement multiple simultaneous systems designed to convince the bear to retreat from the research station complex. The situation required escalating intervention to prevent potential tragedy. The bear's investigation revealed a damaged section of exterior wall near a research equipment installation, providing a potential entry point that attracted his sustained attention. His behavior suggested recognition of structural vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Elena coordinated emergency protocols with all station personnel, ensuring that backup communication systems remained operational and that emergency medical supplies were readily accessible. The bear's persistence created ongoing threats that required sustained defensive preparation. "He's found a potential entry point," Sarah reported via radio, watching the bear's investigation focus on the damaged wall section. "We need immediate intervention before he attempts to breach the building." The polar bear began testing the damaged wall section more aggressively, using his claws and weight to assess the barrier's structural integrity. His behavior suggested learned experience with breaching similar obstacles during previous encounters. Dr. Holloway made the decision to deploy multiple deterrent systems simultaneously, hoping that coordinated stimulus would convince the bear to abandon his investigation and retreat from the research station. The escalation represented their final option before considering lethal force. Flares, noisemakers, and emergency lighting activated simultaneously, creating a sensory barrage designed to overwhelm the bear's comfort level with the human installation. The coordinated deterrent deployment represented the research team's most aggressive, non-lethal intervention option. The polar bear reacted to the deterrent deployment by rearing back from the building, his massive form silhouetted against the artificial lighting. For a moment, it appeared that the coordinated intervention had succeeded in convincing him to retreat from the immediate area. But rather than fleeing, the bear's reaction suggested anger rather than fear. His body language shifted from curious investigation toward aggressive posturing, with ears flattened and head lowered in a threatening stance. The deterrent deployment had escalated rather than resolved the dangerous encounter. Elena immediately activated emergency protocols for aggressive bear encounter, coordinating with all personnel to implement maximum security measures. The situation had evolved from manageable wildlife encounter toward immediate life-threatening emergency, requiring potential lethal force authorization. Sarah felt her blood freeze as she witnessed the bear's behavioral shift from curiosity toward aggression. Years of research experience had taught her to recognize the warning signs of imminent polar bear attack, and the animal's posture indicated maximum danger levels. The polar bear approached the damaged wall section with renewed determination, his massive claws scraping against the exterior barriers as he tested the structure's resistance to forced entry. His behavior now showed clear intent to breach the building's defenses. Jennifer realized that their situation had evolved from extraordinary wildlife encounter toward potential life-or-death survival scenario. Professional obligations to document the story conflicted with basic human survival instincts as the bear's aggression escalated. Marcus continued filming despite his terror, recognizing that the footage might provide crucial evidence for understanding polar bear attack patterns and improving future safety protocols. His professional training provided a framework for action even as his survival instincts screamed for him to flee. Dr. Holloway retrieved the research station's emergency firearm, a high-powered rifle designed specifically for polar bear defense. Arctic regulations required such weapons at remote installations, though their use represented absolute last resort measures with serious legal and conservation implications. The bear's claws found purchase on the damaged wall section, and the sound of scraping metal echoed through the building as he attempted to enlarge the potential entry point. His persistence and problem-solving approach demonstrated intelligence that made him exceptionally dangerous. Elena coordinated with emergency services to declare immediate life-threatening emergency status, activating all available rescue and evacuation resources despite weather limitations. The situation required maximum response preparation, even if immediate intervention remained impossible. "Preparing for potential breach," Elena announced over the emergency communication system. "All personnel implement maximum security protocols immediately." Sarah moved away from the wall section, where the bear was attempting entry, seeking the most secure location within the laboratory building. The structure had been designed to withstand Arctic conditions, but not necessarily aggressive investigation by an 800-pound predator. The polar bear's efforts to breach the damaged wall intensified, with visible damage accumulating as his claws and weight tested the barrier's structural integrity. His systematic approach suggested experience with similar obstacles that increased the likelihood of successful entry. Jennifer activated her emergency beacon, broadcasting distress signals that would be detected by rescue coordination centers and emergency response systems throughout the Arctic region. The beacon provided GPS coordinates and emergency status information even if communication systems failed. Marcus positioned himself to maintain documentation capabilities while maximizing personal safety, recognizing that footage of an actual polar bear building breach would provide unprecedented research data, assuming anyone survived to analyze it. Dr. Holloway took position with the emergency rifle, hoping that the bear's entry attempt would fail, but prepared to use lethal force if the animal succeeded in breaching the building's defenses. The decision to kill a polar bear carried serious legal and conservation implications, but human lives took priority. The damaged wall section began showing signs of structural failure as the bear's persistent efforts created expanding breaches in the exterior barrier. His intelligence and persistence were proving more effective than the research team had anticipated when designing their safety protocols. Elena maintained constant communication with rescue services, providing real-time updates on the bear's breach attempts and the facility's defensive capabilities. The information would inform emergency response planning and potential evacuation operations. Sarah felt the building shake as the bear's efforts intensified, with debris falling from the ceiling as structural stress increased throughout the laboratory. The realization that their shelter might not hold against the bear's determined assault created panic that threatened to overwhelm rational thinking. The polar bear's massive head became visible through the enlarging breach as his efforts achieved partial success in overcoming the building's exterior defenses. His black eyes surveyed the interior space as he assessed the contents and occupants of the human structure. Jennifer faced the terrible realization that professional documentation and personal survival might prove mutually exclusive as the bear's breach attempt neared success. The story that had begun as routine science communication was evolving toward tragedy that would traumatize viewers across the nation. Marcus continued filming even as the bear achieved partial entry, his professional instincts overriding survival reflexes that screamed at him to flee. The footage would provide invaluable research data about polar bear behavior and attack patterns regardless of personal consequences. Dr. Holloway aimed the emergency rifle at the breach point, knowing that he might need to kill the bear to protect human lives. The decision represented failure of all non-lethal deterrent measures and carried consequences that would affect wildlife conservation efforts throughout the Arctic. The bear's massive shoulders became visible as he worked to enlarge the breach sufficiently for full entry into the building. His persistence and problem-solving capabilities demonstrated intelligence that made him exceptionally dangerous in confined spaces with human occupants. Elena coordinated final emergency preparations, ensuring that medical supplies and communication equipment remained accessible even if the building's defenses failed completely. The bear's likely success in breaching their shelter required preparation for the worst-case scenarios. "He's almost through," Sarah announced, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Prepare for full breach and potential attack." The polar bear's entry attempt succeeded as structural failure allowed him to force passage through the damaged wall section. 800 pounds of apex predator entered the building, bringing immediate mortal danger to all occupants of the previously secure laboratory space. Jennifer felt primal terror as the massive predator filled the breach opening, his enormous size overwhelming in the confined space of the laboratory. The bear's presence transformed the scientific workspace into a potential death trap, with limited escape options for the human occupants. Marcus captured footage of the actual breach as the polar bear entered the building, documenting unprecedented examples of predator problem-solving behavior and human-wildlife conflict escalation. The scientific value of the documentation competed with immediate survival requirements. Dr. Holloway maintained his aim at the massive predator, finger on the rifle's trigger, as he evaluated the immediate threat level and calculated optimal shot placement. The confined space complicated firearm deployment while simultaneously increasing the danger from an aggressive polar bear. The bear paused just inside the breach, his massive head surveying the laboratory's interior and assessing the humans, equipment, and potential resources contained within the space. His behavior remained evaluative rather than immediately aggressive, suggesting continued curiosity despite the dramatic escalation. Elena activated final emergency protocols, broadcasting maximum distress signals and providing detailed situation reports to rescue coordination centers. The bear's successful building breach represented catastrophic security failure, requiring immediate external intervention despite weather limitations. Sarah pressed herself against the far wall of the laboratory, seeking maximum distance from the massive predator while evaluating potential escape routes through other exits. The bear's presence in the confined space created claustrophobic terror that challenged rational thinking. The polar bear's investigation of the laboratory interior revealed his extraordinary sensory capabilities as he processed complex chemical signatures from scientific equipment, human occupants, and stored supplies. His systematic approach suggested intelligence that made prediction of his next actions extremely difficult. Jennifer maintained her documentation efforts despite the mortal danger, recognizing that footage of an actual polar bear interior invasion would provide unprecedented research data about predator behavior and human-wildlife conflict escalation patterns. Marcus adjusted his camera position to maintain coverage while seeking protective positioning, balancing professional obligations with survival priorities as the situation evolved toward potential tragedy. The technical challenges of filming a polar bear attack created unique professional demands. Dr. Holloway tracked the bear's movements through his rifle sights, prepared to shoot if the animal showed aggressive intent toward human occupants. The decision to use lethal force remained difficult despite the clear threat to human lives from the massive predator's presence. The bear moved deeper into the laboratory, investigating scientific equipment and stored supplies with systematic thoroughness. His behavior suggested learned association between human installations and potential food resources, making his continued presence extremely dangerous for building occupants. Elena coordinated lockdown of other research station buildings to prevent the bear from expanding his investigation to additional structures and personnel. The successful breach of one building created precedent that threatened the security of the entire installation. Sarah observed the bear's systematic investigation with scientific fascination despite her terror, recognizing that his behavior provided unprecedented insights into polar bear adaptive capabilities and problem-solving intelligence in human-modified environments. The polar bear's attention focused on stored food supplies, confirming suspicions that learned associations between human installations and resources motivated his persistent investigation despite deterrent measures. His behavior validated wildlife management concerns about habituation patterns. Jennifer realized that the encounter had evolved beyond documentation towards survival priorities as the massive predator continued investigating the laboratory interior. Professional obligations competed with basic human survival instincts in the confined space with limited escape options. Marcus maintained filming position while evaluating escape routes, recognizing that documentation of actual polar bear interior behavior would provide invaluable research data, assuming personnel survived to analyze the footage. The scientific and professional implications created complex decision frameworks. Dr. Holloway waited for clear shot opportunity while monitoring the bear's behavior for signs of escalating aggression toward human occupants. The confined space created tactical challenges for effective firearm deployment while simultaneously increasing danger levels from the massive predator. The bear's investigation revealed stored emergency food supplies, providing reward for his problem-solving efforts and reinforcing learned associations that made future similar encounters more likely. His success in breaching human defenses and obtaining resources created dangerous precedent for wildlife management. Elena maintained emergency communications while coordinating defensive preparations for other station personnel, recognizing that the bear's success created ongoing threats throughout the research installation. The situation required comprehensive response despite limited immediate intervention options. "He's accessing food supplies," Sarah reported, watching the bear's investigation focus on stored emergency rations. This reinforces learned behavior patterns that will make him extremely dangerous in future encounters. The polar bear's consumption of human food supplies confirmed the worst fears of wildlife management experts regarding habituation patterns that created dangerous human-wildlife conflicts. His success would reinforce behavioral patterns that posed ongoing threats to Arctic installations and personnel. Jennifer documented the bear's resource acquisition behavior, recognizing that footage of polar bears obtaining food rewards from human sources would influence wildlife management policies and safety protocols throughout Arctic regions. Marcus captured footage of the bear's systematic investigation techniques, providing unprecedented documentation of polar bear problem-solving capabilities in human-modified environments. The scientific value of the footage balanced against personal danger created complex professional calculations. Dr. Holloway maintained defensive positioning while evaluating the bear's behavior for escalation indicators, prepared to use lethal force if the animal showed aggression toward human occupants, despite his current focus on resource acquisition rather than predatory behavior. The bear's behavior in the laboratory demonstrated remarkable intelligence as he differentiated between various types of stored supplies and equipment, showing preference for food resources while ignoring scientific instruments and electronic equipment. His selective behavior indicated sophisticated sensory discrimination capabilities. Elena coordinated with emergency services to maintain situational awareness despite communication limitations, providing detailed updates on bear behavior patterns and facility security status. The information would inform rescue planning and wildlife management policy development. Sarah studied the bear's behavior with professional interest despite her personal terror, recognizing that direct observation of polar bear interior investigation provided research opportunities unavailable through traditional field studies. The scientific implications competed with immediate survival concerns. The polar bear completed his investigation of the accessible food supplies and began investigating other aspects of the laboratory interior, including human occupants who had remained motionless throughout his resource acquisition activities. His attention shift created immediate escalation of danger levels. Jennifer felt renewed terror as the massive predator's attention shifted toward human occupants, recognizing that curiosity about food sources might evolve toward investigation of the humans themselves. The bear's behavior patterns remained unpredictable despite extensive observation. Marcus adjusted his documentation approach as the bear's attention shifted toward human occupants, balancing professional requirements with personal safety considerations. The footage would provide unprecedented documentation of human polar bear interaction patterns in confined spaces. Dr. Holloway tightened his grip on the emergency rifle as the bear's investigation shifted toward human occupants, prepared to shoot if the animal showed predatory intent. The decision to use lethal force became more likely as the encounter evolved toward direct human-bear interaction. The bear approached Sarah's position, his massive size overwhelming in the confined laboratory space. His investigation appeared curious rather than immediately aggressive, but polar bears were known for rapid behavioral shifts that could prove fatal to human beings. Elena activated final emergency protocols, broadcasting maximum priority distress calls to all available rescue resources despite weather limitations and distance factors. The bear's direct investigation of human occupants created immediate life-threatening emergency requiring maximum response. Sarah remained motionless as the enormous predator approached within arm's reach, his black nose testing the air around her position. The bear's massive size was overwhelming at such close proximity, with his head alone larger than her entire torso. The polar bear's investigation of Sarah intensified as he detected complex human sense and attempted to understand this unusual creature he had encountered. His behavior remained curious rather than predatory, but the potential for rapid escalation created continuous mortal danger. Jennifer watched in fascination and terror as the massive predator investigated her colleague, recognizing that the encounter provided unprecedented footage of human polar bear interaction while simultaneously creating immediate danger for all laboratory occupants. Marcus captured extraordinary footage of direct human-polar bear interaction, documenting behavioral patterns that would influence wildlife management and safety protocols throughout Arctic regions. The scientific value of the documentation competed with immediate personal danger. Dr. Holloway aimed at the bear's center mass, prepared to fire if the animal's investigation escalated toward aggression. The confined space created optimal shooting conditions, while simultaneously increasing danger from potential wounded animal reactions. The bear's investigation of Sarah remained non-aggressive but intensely curious, with his massive head moving around her position as he processed various sensory inputs. His behavior suggested intelligence that made prediction of next actions extremely difficult. Elena coordinated maximum emergency response activation despite environmental limitations, recognizing that direct human-bear contact created immediate life-threatening situation requiring all available intervention resources, regardless of weather conditions or logistical challenges. Sarah felt the bear's breath on her face as his investigation intensified, the warm exhalation contrasting sharply with the Arctic cold that permeated the damaged building. His massive presence filled her entire sensory awareness as she fought to remain motionless. The polar bear's behavior towards Sarah showed remarkable restraint considering his size and predatory capabilities, suggesting that curiosity, rather than hunger, motivated his investigation of the human occupants. His intelligence was evident in his careful, non-destructive approach to understanding unfamiliar creatures. Jennifer maintained documentation despite the extreme danger to her colleague, recognizing that footage of non-aggressive polar bear behavior toward humans would provide valuable insights for wildlife management and human safety protocols in Arctic regions. Marcus adjusted camera angles to capture the complete interaction between Sarah and the polar bear, balancing professional documentation requirements with personal safety considerations as the situation remained unpredictable and potentially lethal. Dr. Holloway maintained his defensive position while monitoring the bear's body language for escalation indicators, prepared to intervene with lethal force if the animal's behavior shifted from curiosity toward aggression or predatory intent. The bear completed his investigation of Sarah and moved toward Jennifer's position, his systematic approach suggesting intelligent evaluation of each human occupant. His behavior remained curious rather than aggressive, though the potential for rapid escalation continued to create mortal danger. Elena provided continuous updates to emergency services, describing the bear's behavioral patterns and interaction techniques with human occupants. The information would inform immediate rescue planning and contribute to long-term wildlife management policy development. Sarah felt overwhelming relief as the bear's attention shifted away from her position, though she recognized that the encounter remained extremely dangerous for all laboratory occupants. The bear's systematic investigation suggested sustained interest in human activities and resources. The polar bear's approach to Jennifer demonstrated the same careful, curious investigation he had shown towards Sarah, with his massive head moving systematically around her position as he processed sensory information. His behavior continued to show restraint despite his overwhelming physical advantages. Jennifer remained motionless as the enormous predator investigated her position, feeling his warm breath and experiencing the overwhelming presence of 800 pounds of apex predator at close range. Professional composure competed with primal terror as she fought to remain still. Marcus captured footage of the bear's systematic investigation of multiple human subjects, providing unprecedented documentation of polar bear behavior toward humans in confined spaces. The scientific implications of the footage would influence Arctic safety protocols for decades. Dr. Holloway tracked the bear's movements through his rifle sights, maintaining readiness for immediate lethal intervention if the animal's behavior escalated beyond curious investigation toward aggressive or predatory actions against human occupants. The bear's investigation of Jennifer revealed the same intelligent, systematic approach he had shown throughout the encounter, demonstrating remarkable sensory capabilities and behavioral restraint considering his size and predatory nature. His behavior suggested high intelligence and adaptability. Elena maintained maximum priority emergency communications, coordinating with rescue services to prepare all available intervention resources despite environmental limitations. The sustained human-bear interaction created ongoing life-threatening emergency requiring comprehensive response preparation. The polar bear completed his investigation of Jennifer and began investigating Marcus and his camera equipment, apparently intrigued by the electronic devices and their unfamiliar sounds and electromagnetic signatures. His curiosity extended beyond human occupants to include technological elements. Jennifer felt relief as the bear's attention shifted away from her position, though she recognized that the encounter remained extremely dangerous for all personnel. The bear's sustained presence in the laboratory created ongoing threats that required continued vigilance and preparation. Marcus maintained filming while becoming the subject of the bear's investigation, creating unique documentation challenges as he balanced professional requirements with personal safety, while serving as both observer and participant in the encounter. Dr. Holloway adjusted his defensive position to maintain clear shooting lanes as the bear's investigation continued, prepared for immediate intervention if the animal's behavior escalated beyond curious exploration toward aggressive or predatory actions. The bear's investigation of Marcus's camera equipment demonstrated remarkable intelligence as he attempted to understand the unfamiliar electronic devices and their functions. His careful approach to the technology suggested learning capabilities that exceeded simple curiosity about novel objects. Elena coordinated defensive preparations for potential bear expansion into other research station buildings, recognizing that his success in breaching laboratory security created precedent for investigating additional structures and threatening other personnel. Sarah observed the bear's investigation techniques with professional fascination, recognizing that direct observation of polar bear problem-solving behavior provided research insights unavailable through traditional field studies. The scientific value competed with immediate survival concerns. The polar bear's systematic investigation of the laboratory interior continued for over an hour, demonstrating patience and intelligence that exceeded typical wildlife behavior patterns. His sustained presence created ongoing psychological stress for human occupants while providing unprecedented behavioral documentation. Jennifer maintained her documentation efforts throughout the extended encounter, recognizing that footage of sustained human polar bear interaction would provide invaluable research data for wildlife management and safety protocol development in Arctic regions. Marcus continued filming despite equipment challenges created by extreme cold and the stress of serving simultaneously as documenter and subject of the polar bear's investigation. The technical and personal demands created unique professional challenges. Dr. Holloway maintained defensive readiness throughout the extended encounter, monitoring the bear's behavior for any signs of escalation while hoping that the animal's curiosity would eventually lead to voluntary departure from the research facility. The bear's investigation revealed remarkable adaptability and learning capability as he systematically explored every aspect of the human installation, from technology and equipment to stored supplies and human occupants. His behavior demonstrated intelligence that made him exceptionally capable and dangerous. Elena provided continuous updates to rescue services, maintaining communication links that would facilitate immediate intervention if weather conditions improve sufficiently to allow helicopter operations. The sustained emergency required ongoing coordination despite environmental limitations. Sarah recognized that the encounter had lasted far longer than typical polar bear-human interactions, suggesting an individual with unusual tolerance for human presence and exceptional curiosity about human activities. The bear's behavior patterns would influence future wildlife management policies. The polar bear's eventual departure from the laboratory occurred as gradually as his initial approach, with decreasing interest in the human installation leading to systematic withdrawal through the breach he had created. His exit left the research team traumatized but alive. Jennifer felt overwhelming relief as the massive predator finally departed, recognizing that survival of the encounter represented extraordinary fortune given the bear's size, capabilities, and unprecedented behavior patterns. The experience would influence her perspective on wilderness safety permanently. Marcus continued filming the bear's departure, completing documentation of the entire encounter from initial approach through final withdrawal. The footage would provide comprehensive behavioral analysis opportunities for wildlife researchers and safety protocol developers. Dr. Holloway maintained defensive positioning until visual confirmation of the bear's complete departure from the research station area, recognizing that polar bears often returned to locations where they had obtained resources or positive experiences. Elena coordinated damage assessment and security restoration procedures, working with all station personnel to evaluate structural integrity and restore defensive capabilities following the bear's successful breach of laboratory security systems. Sarah began processing the scientific implications of the encounter, recognizing that direct observation of polar bear problem-solving behavior and human interaction patterns would contribute significantly to understanding predator adaptation to human-modified environments. The aftermath of the encounter required comprehensive reporting to wildlife management authorities, emergency services, and research oversight organizations. The bear's behavior patterns and successful breach of security protocols would influence safety regulations throughout Arctic research installations. Jennifer prepared comprehensive coverage of the encounter for broadcast audiences, balancing dramatic human interest elements with educational content about polar bear behavior and climate change impacts on Arctic ecosystems and wildlife adaptation patterns. Marcus reviewed footage of the entire encounter, recognizing that the documentation captured unprecedented examples of polar bear intelligence, problem-solving capabilities, and behavioral adaptation to human presence in Arctic environments. Dr. Holloway coordinated with wildlife management authorities to report the encounter and implement tracking procedures for the individual bear, whose behavior patterns posed ongoing threats to research installations and personnel throughout the region. The research team's survival of the encounter created unique opportunities to contribute first-hand behavioral observations to polar bear research and wildlife management policy development, though the psychological trauma would require professional counseling and extended recovery periods. Elena maintained communication with rescue services to confirm personnel safety and facility security, recognizing that the encounter had created precedent for similar incidents as polar bears continued adapting to human presence in Arctic regions. The bear's successful breach of research station security and acquisition of food resources reinforced learned behavior patterns that would make him increasingly dangerous in future encounters with human installations and personnel throughout his territory. Sarah's scientific observations of the encounter provided unprecedented insights into polar bear intelligence, adaptability, and behavioral flexibility in response to human-modified environments, contributing valuable data to climate change and wildlife adaptation research. The encounter's documentation, through live broadcast footage, created public awareness of polar bear behavioral changes and climate change impacts on Arctic ecosystems, potentially influencing conservation policy and funding for wildlife research programs. Jennifer's reporting of the encounter balanced dramatic human interest elements with educational content about environmental changes affecting Arctic wildlife behavior and increasing conflicts between polar bears and human activities in northern regions. The research team's experience highlighted the need for improved safety protocols and security systems at Arctic installations as polar bears demonstrated increasing capability and willingness to investigate and breach human structures in search of resources. Marcus's footage provided comprehensive documentation of the encounter for analysis by wildlife researchers, safety protocol developers, and emergency response planners working to reduce risks associated with human activities in polar bear territory. Dr. Holloway's wildlife management experience proved crucial for the team's survival, demonstrating the importance of comprehensive safety training and emergency preparedness for personnel working in Arctic environments with dangerous wildlife populations. The encounter occurred during a period of rapid environmental change in Arctic regions, with shifting ice patterns and climate conditions bringing polar bears into increased contact with human activities and installations throughout their traditional territory. Elena's coordination of emergency response procedures maintained communication links and safety protocols throughout the encounter, demonstrating the critical importance of comprehensive emergency planning for remote installations in dangerous wildlife habitat. The bear's behavior throughout the encounter suggested an individual with extensive previous experience investigating human installations, raising questions about the effectiveness of current deterrent methods and wildlife management strategies in Arctic regions. Sarah's research on polar bear behavioral adaptation proved prophetic, as the encounter demonstrated exactly the types of learned behaviors and human-wildlife conflicts that her studies had predicted would increase with continued environmental change. The successful documentation of the encounter provided valuable educational content about polar bear behavior, Arctic ecosystems, and climate change impacts, potentially influencing public understanding and support for conservation efforts in northern regions. Jennifer's professional coverage of the encounter balanced safety concerns with journalistic obligations, demonstrating the challenges faced by media personnel reporting on environmental stories in remote and dangerous locations. The research station's partial breach by the polar bear revealed vulnerabilities in current Arctic installation security systems, highlighting the need for improved structural designs and deterrent technologies to protect personnel in polar bear territory. Marcus's technical expertise with broadcast equipment under extreme conditions proved essential for documenting the encounter, providing footage that would influence safety protocols and wildlife management policies for Arctic installations. Dr. Holloway's preparation to use lethal force highlighted the complex ethical and legal issues surrounding wildlife management in Arctic regions, where human safety requirements must be balanced against conservation priorities for threatened species. The encounter's resolution without casualties represented extraordinary fortune given polar bear capabilities and attack patterns documented in previous incidents, suggesting that the individual bear's behavior was unusual rather than typical for the species. Elena's maintenance of emergency communications throughout the encounter ensured that rescue services remained informed and prepared for intervention, demonstrating the critical importance of redundant communication systems in remote Arctic installations. The bear's successful acquisition of food resources from the research station reinforced behavioral patterns that posed ongoing threats to Arctic installations throughout his territory, requiring coordinated wildlife management responses to prevent future incidents. Sarah's observations of polar bear problem-solving behavior provided research insights unavailable through traditional field studies, contributing valuable data to understanding predator intelligence and adaptation capabilities in changing environmental conditions. The live broadcast documentation of the encounter created unprecedented public awareness of polar bear behavioral changes and human-wildlife conflicts in Arctic regions, potentially influencing conservation policy and research funding priorities. Jennifer's survival of the encounter while maintaining professional documentation responsibilities demonstrated the dedication required for environmental journalism in remote and dangerous locations where important stories intersect with significant personal risks. The research team's experience highlighted the importance of comprehensive safety training, emergency preparedness, and wildlife management expertise for personnel working in Arctic environments where climate change is increasing human-wildlife conflicts. Marcus's footage of the encounter provided comprehensive behavioral documentation that would influence safety protocols, emergency response procedures, and structural design standards for installations in polar bear territory throughout Arctic regions. Dr. Holloway's wildlife management experience and emergency preparedness proved crucial for maintaining team safety throughout the encounter, demonstrating the importance of experienced leadership for Arctic research operations in dangerous wildlife habitat. The encounter occurred at Whitecap Research Station during a period of unprecedented environmental change in Arctic regions, with shifting climate conditions and ice patterns bringing polar bears into increased conflict with human activities and installations. Elena's coordination of emergency response and communication systems maintained safety protocols throughout the encounter, providing a framework for successful management of extremely dangerous wildlife situations in remote Arctic locations. The polar bear's behavior demonstrated adaptation capabilities that exceeded current wildlife management assumptions, suggesting the need for revised safety protocols and deterrent strategies for Arctic installations in polar bear territory. Sarah's research predictions about increasing human polar bear conflicts proved accurate, as the encounter demonstrated exactly the types of behavioral changes and habituation patterns that her studies had identified as emerging threats in Arctic regions. The successful documentation of the encounter through live broadcast created unique educational opportunities about polar bear behavior, climate change impacts, and Arctic ecosystem changes, potentially influencing public understanding and conservation policy development. The research team's survival of an encounter that could easily have resulted in fatalities highlighted both the unpredictable nature of polar bear behavior and the critical importance of comprehensive emergency preparedness for Arctic operations. This unprecedented encounter between humans and a polar bear at Whitecap Research Station provided extraordinary insights into predator behavior, human-wildlife conflict dynamics, and the complex challenges of conducting scientific research in Earth's most dangerous and rapidly changing environments.